Let this be a warning. In the concrete heart of New York, a single moment can shatter a life or build a new one. When a desperate man chooses compassion over ambition, he sets in motion an unforeseen chain of events. This is a story where integrity is tested and kindness becomes a revolutionary force. Prepare to witness how one selfless act can alter the very fabric of reality and redeem a world hungry for hope. What you're about to hear today might change the way you see things. But first, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the ending. The groan of the ancient plumbing in the walls was the first sound Michael registered, a dissonant symphony to another morning of quiet desperation. He lay still for a moment on the lumpy couch, the springs digging into his back with a familiar, accusatory pressure. This was his bed, had been for the 3 years since Sarah left, leaving behind a void filled by the soft, rhythmic breathing from the tiny bedroom. The air in the studio apartment was thick, smelling of yesterday's cheap coffee and the faint, ever-present dampness that seeped through the single window overlooking a brick wall. 45 years old, the number echoed in his skull, a heavy, inert weight. He pushed himself up, the worn fabric of the couch sighing in relief. His body ached, not from any strenuous labor, but from the cumulative strain of worry, of applying for jobs that vanished into digital voids, of calculating how many more months, weeks, days the dwindling savings would last. His goal for the day, for his life, was simple, terrifying, and absolute. Get the job at Global Tech. He padded over to the small kitchenette, its counter crowded with a toaster that only worked on one side and a microwave with a perpetually stuck door. The ritual was automatic. Scoop the last of the generic brand coffee grounds, pour water into the stained machine, press the button, and pray it didn't sputter and die. While it gurgled, he turned. Lily was still asleep, a small lump under the pink comforter adorned with cartoon astronauts, a relic from a more hopeful time. Her dark hair fanned out on the pillow, her face serene and untouched by the arithmetic of survival that haunted his every waking moment. She was 7. She needed new shoes. She talked about a school trip to the Natural History Museum that cost $40. She was the why. She was the only why. The coffee finished with a final wet gasp. He poured a mug, the ceramic chipped on the handle, and took a sip. It was bitter, but it was fuel. He had to be sharp. He had to be impressive. He had to be the man the sleek glass and steel world of Global Tech would want to hire. His one good suit, a charcoal gray he'd bought a lifetime ago for his wedding, was hanging from the curtain rod in a futile attempt to steam out the wrinkles. He took it down, the fabric feeling flimsy in his hands. He laid it on the couch with the reverence of a priest preparing vestments. The shirt was white, crisp from the laundromat, but the cuffs were starting to fray. He'd have to keep his jacket on. "Daddy?" Her voice, soft with sleep, cut through his preparations. Lily was sitting up in bed, rubbing her eyes with small fists. "Hey, sleepyhead," he said, his voice softening instantly, the tight coil of anxiety in his chest loosening a fraction. He walked over and sat on the edge of her bed, the mattress dipping significantly. "How'd you sleep?" "Okay, you're wearing the scratchy clothes. I have a very important meeting today, remember? The one at the big shiny building." "The one with the job?" she asked, her eyes wide and serious. "That's the one." He smoothed her hair back from her forehead. "Aunt Carol is going to walk you to school today, and she'll pick you up. You be good for her, okay? I'm always good." She gave him a gap-toothed smile that could power a city block. "You'll get it, Daddy. You're the smartest." The simple, unwavering faith in her statement was a lance through his heart. It was the most precious thing he possessed and the heaviest burden. He kissed her forehead, inhaling the scent of baby shampoo and unconditional love. "We'll see, sweet pea. Now, up and at 'em. Breakfast." The next hour was a carefully choreographed dance of controlled chaos. He got Lily dressed, packed her lunchbox with a peanut butter sandwich and an apple, and managed to toast a bagel for her without the toaster giving out. He himself couldn't eat. His stomach was a tangled knot of nerves. He moved with a forced calm, his mind already racing ahead, rehearsing answers to potential interview questions. My greatest weakness? An obsessive attention to detail. My 5-year plan? To grow with a forward-thinking company like Global Tech, contributing my skills in data analysis to... He watched Lily, a small, bright spot in the drab apartment, and felt a surge of protective ferocity. This job wasn't just a paycheck. It was a lifeline. It was ballet lessons and new shoes, and not having to lie awake at night, listening for the sound of the landlord's footsteps in the hall. It was the chance to give her a childhood that wasn't painted in shades of anxiety. The obstacle wasn't just the other candidates. It was his own age, the gap in his resume. The quiet desperation he feared was visible in his eyes. Finally, Aunt Carol arrived, a whirlwind of cheerful efficiency and strong perfume that momentarily overpowered the scent of damp. She hugged Lily and gave Michael a long, appraising look. "You look handsome, Mikey. Very professional. You've got this. Thanks, Carol. I appreciate you doing this. Go on, get out of here. Knock 'em dead." She shooed him towards the door. He knelt down, and Lily threw her arms around his neck. "Bye, Daddy. I love you." "I love you more than anything in the world," he whispered into her hair, the words a vow. Then he was out the door, the click of the lock behind him sounding like a starting pistol. The hallway of the old walk-up was dim and smelled of cabbage and disinfectant. He took the stairs 2 at a time, his dress shoes echoing on the chipped linoleum. The goal was clear, a beacon in the fog of his life. Get to the Global Tech Tower in Midtown by 10 a.m. Do not be late. Do not falter. He burst out onto the sidewalk of his Brooklyn neighborhood, and the city hit him like a physical blow. The air, thick with the exhaust of idling cars and the scent of greasy breakfast from a nearby bodega, was a shock after the cloistered atmosphere of the apartment. The noise was a constant, roaring beast. The blare of horns, the shriek of a distant siren, the rumble of the elevated J train overhead, the cacophony of 1,000 different lives colliding. He checked his watch, a cheap digital thing with a cracked face. 8:45 a.m. He had time. The plan was to take the L train to 14th Street, then switch to the 405 Express up to Grand Central. It was tight, but doable. Hope, a fragile, fluttering thing, began to beat in his chest. He joined the river of people flowing towards the subway entrance, a current of humanity he usually found oppressive. Today it felt like momentum. He kept his head down, his leather-bound portfolio, a relic from his last corporate job, clutched tightly to his chest like a shield. He rehearsed his opening line. "Good morning, my name is Michael Thorne. I have a 10 o'clock interview with Ms. Davison in HR." Confident, firm. He descended into the hot, stale breath of the subway station, swiped his Metro card, and pushed through the turnstile. The platform was packed, a wall of bodies. He could feel the sweat starting to prickle on his back beneath the cheap suit jacket. The air vibrated with the approaching train, a deep, growing roar that promised movement, progress. But when the train screeched to a halt and the doors opened, it was already a sardine can. People shoved and elbowed their way on. Michael took a deep breath and pushed forward, his body pressed against strangers, the smell of sweat and perfume and stale coffee filling his nostrils. The doors hissed shut, trapping him in the hot, airless metal tube. He was in. That was the first hurdle. The train lurched forward, then stopped. A collective groan went through the car. The conductor's voice, garbled and staticky, came over the intercom. "Signal problems. Ahead of us. Stand by." Michael's heart hammered against his ribs. No. He checked his watch. 9:05. They sat there, suspended in the dark tunnel, for 5 minutes that felt like an hour. The air grew hotter, thicker. He could feel the precious minutes of his buffer slipping away. The obstacle was no longer abstract. It was the immovable machinery of the city itself, indifferent to his desperation. Finally, the train jolted back to life, moving slowly, agonizingly so. It crawled from station to station, each stop a fresh torment as more people crammed in. By the time it reached 14th Street, it was 9:35. His plan was in tatters. He fought his way off the train, his suit now rumpled and damp, and sprinted up the stairs to the Lexington Avenue line, his lungs burning. The platform for the 4 and 5 trains was a scene of pure chaos. A sea of people stretched from one end to the other, all restless, all waiting. The electronic board was flashing. Downtown 4 train. 2 min Uptown 4 train. Delayed. Uptown 5 train. 12 min delayed. The word was a death sentence. Panic, cold and sharp, began to claw its way up his throat, choking him. His carefully constructed composure shattered. The confident answers, the firm handshake, the professional demeanor, it all felt like a ridiculous fantasy now. The reality was, this sweaty, frantic man on a crowded platform, watching his future dissolve in a haze of MTA incompetence. He couldn't just stand there. He had to move. His mind raced, discarding options. A cab, in this traffic? It would be a fortune he didn't have, and likely just as slow. A bus, worse. He looked at his watch again. 9:45, 15 minutes to get from 14th Street to 42nd. It was impossible. Unless a reckless, desperate idea took root. He could run. It was over 20 blocks, but he had no choice. It was the only card left to play. He turned and shoved his way back up the stairs, emerging onto 14th Street, gasping. The sun was bright, glaring off the windshields of the gridlocked traffic. The honking was incessant, a symphony of frustration. He oriented himself north and started to run. His dress shoes were not made for this. They pinched and slid on the pavement. His portfolio slapped against his leg. He weaved through the crowds on the sidewalk, muttering, "Sorry, excuse me," his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was too old for this. His knees screamed in protest. But he pushed on, Lily's face floating in his mind, her voice, "You'll get it, Daddy," a mantra driving him forward. He passed Union Square, the Flatiron Building, a blur of landmarks he didn't register. His world narrowed to the pounding of his heart, the burning in his lungs, and the relentless upward climb of the city blocks. 3rd, 8th, 34th. He dodged tourists, delivery bikes, steaming hot dog carts. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes, soaking through his shirt and suit jacket. He was a mess. He would arrive looking like a man who had just lost a fight. He skidded to a halt at the corner of 42nd and Lexington, the colossal, shimmering spire of the Global Tech Tower looming above him. He bent over, hands on his knees, sucking in great, painful gulps of air. He checked his watch. 10:04, he was 4 minutes late. The hope that had fluttered in his chest on the Brooklyn sidewalk was gone, replaced by a cold, heavy dread. He had failed the first, most basic test, punctuality. He straightened up, trying in vain to smooth his hair, to wipe the sweat from his brow with a trembling hand. He looked up at the tower, its reflective glass surface mirroring the chaotic scene of the street below, a perfect, mocking representation of the chasm between the ordered world inside and the messy, unpredictable struggle outside. He had the address. He had the suit. He had the desperate need. He took a shaky step forward, then another, forcing his trembling legs to carry him towards the immense revolving glass doors. The question hung in the air, as palpable as the city's smog, a final, terrifying obstacle before he had even entered the building. Would they even let him in? The immense revolving glass doors of the Global Tech Tower spun with a smooth, hushed whir, a stark contrast to the chaotic roar of 42nd Street. Each person who entered was swallowed by the cool, conditioned air, emerging into a realm of polished calm. Michael stood frozen on the hot sidewalk, a shipwrecked sailor staring at a distant, unattainable shore. 4 minutes late. The digital numbers on his watch were a verdict. His lungs still burned from the frantic 20-block sprint, and his heart hammered a frantic, panicked rhythm against his ribs. The crisp white shirt he had so carefully laid out was now plastered to his back with sweat. The charcoal suit jacket felt like a heavy, damp blanket, and he could feel a trickle of perspiration tracing a path from his temple down his cheek. Just go in. You're here. That's something. But the voice of reason, the one that calculated survival, whispered a colder truth. They'll take one look at you, a disheveled, middle-aged man, panting and late. They'll know you don't belong here. Lily's face, serene and trusting in sleep, flashed behind his eyes. You'll get it, Daddy. You're the smartest. The memory was a physical ache, a lance of pure love and crushing responsibility. He couldn't turn back. The lifeline was inside that building, even if it felt like he was already too late to grab it. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the air a foul cocktail of bus exhaust and pretzel cart steam, and pushed his way into the revolving door. The world outside vanished, replaced by a sudden, sterile silence. The lobby was a cathedral of corporate wealth. A vaulted ceiling soared stories above, a massive, abstract sculpture of twisting metal and light dangling in the center. The floor was a sea of immaculate white marble, reflecting the cool glow of recessed lighting. The air smelled of lemon-scented cleaner and money. Across the vast expanse, a fortress-like security desk stood guard, manned by two uniformed officers who looked bored and impenetrable. To the right, a bank of elevators with brushed steel doors gleamed under the lights. People moved through the space with quiet purpose, their footsteps echoing softly. Men in tailored suits, women in sharp sheaths, all radiating an aura of unshakable competence. Michael felt like a stain on the perfect marble. He approached the security desk, his worn leather portfolio clutched like a talisman. One of the guards, a large man with a close-shaven head and a name tag that read O'Malley, looked up, his expression neutral. "Help you?" he asked, his voice devoid of inflection. "Good morning," Michael began, his own voice sounding rough and breathy in the hushed space. He cleared his throat, trying to force it into the confident, firm tone he had practiced. "My name is Michael Thorne. I have a 10 o'clock interview with Ms. Davison in Human Resources." O'Malley's eyes did a quick, professional sweep of Michael's disheveled appearance. There was no judgment in his gaze, only assessment. He tapped at a tablet on the desk. "Thorne, 10 a.m. with Janice Davison." He looked up. "You're a few minutes past 10, sir." The words were a simple statement of fact, but they landed on Michael like a physical blow. "I know, I'm so sorry. The subway. There were signal problems, then delays on the 4 and 5. I ran from 14th Street. The explanation tumbled out, pathetic and pleading. He sounded like every other late person with a lame excuse. O'Malley was already picking up a phone. "Let me see if they're still available to see you." He spoke quietly into the receiver. "Hi, this is security. I have a Michael Thorne here for a 10 a.m. with Janice Davison. Yes, he just arrived." "Okay, I'll let him know." He hung up and looked back at Michael. "They said they'll see you. You'll need to sign in. Take elevator bank C to the 38th floor. Check in with the receptionist there." A wave of dizzying relief washed over Michael so powerfully his knees felt weak. They hadn't written him off. Not yet. "Thank you. Thank you so much." He fumbled with the visitor sign-in process, his hands trembling slightly, then accepted the temporary badge O'Malley printed for him. He walked towards the elevators, the sticky sound of his dress shoes on the marble, a small, embarrassing betrayal. He pressed the call button and stood waiting, trying to surreptitiously smooth his hair and wipe the sweat from his face with his sleeve. In the reflective surface of the elevator doors, he saw a ghost of the man he'd hoped to present. Hair askew, face flushed, suit a collection of wrinkles. He looked desperate. He was desperate. The elevator arrived with a soft chime. He stepped inside alone. The doors slid shut, enclosing him in a silent, mirrored box. He watched his own anxious reflection all the way up to the 38th floor, the numbers on the display climbing with a sickening swiftness. The goal was so close now, just beyond these doors. The obstacle was no longer the city or the clock. It was himself. His age, his frayed cuffs, the story of struggle written all over him. Meanwhile, 40 blocks downtown, a different kind of desperation was unfolding. Inside a black Lincoln Town car stuck in the gridlock on Park Avenue South, Elena Vance was trying to remember how to breathe. The air conditioning was on full blast, but a cold, clammy sweat had broken out all over her body. The world outside the tinted windows, the honking cabs, the bustling pedestrians, seemed to warp and pulse, the colors too bright, the sounds too sharp. "Jerry, how much longer?" she asked, her voice tight. She clutched the script for that evening's live broadcast, the pages crumpling in her damp grasp. "Can't say, Ms. Vance," her driver replied, his eyes flicking to her in the rearview mirror. "Accident up at 23rd. Nothing's moving." Elena Vance. The name was synonymous with sharp journalism and effortless charm. For 15 years, she had been the unflappable anchor of The Vance Point, a nightly news show known for its hard-hitting interviews. Her face was one of the most trusted in America, her composure legendary. But now, in the back of the stifling car, that composure was cracking. A crushing pressure was building behind her eyes, a tight band constricting around her chest. She'd felt off all morning, a lingering dizziness, a nausea she'd attributed to stress. The new network executives were demanding higher ratings. The pressure to break the next big story was immense, and she hadn't slept more than 4 hours a night for weeks. The tightness in her chest intensified, sharpening into a definite, alarming pain. It wasn't just anxiety. This was different. This was a deep, radiating ache that shot down her left arm. A cold dread, far colder than the car's AC, seeped into her bones. This can't be happening. Not now. Not to me. Jerry, she gasped, her hand flying to her chest. I don't feel well. Ms. Vance? Jerry's voice was immediately alarmed. What is it? Should I call an ambulance? An ambulance. It would never get through this traffic. The thought of being trapped in this car, the sight of a spectacle, with cameras appearing from nowhere. The panic escalated, feeding the physical symptoms. The world began to tilt. She saw the concerned look on Jerry's face, his mouth moving, but the sound was muffled, as if she were underwater. I need air, she choked out. I need to get out. Miss Vance, it's gridlock. There's nowhere to... But she was already fumbling for the door handle, her movements clumsy. She shoved the heavy door open, stumbling out onto the hot pavement. The wave of noise and heat hit her like a physical wall. Horns blared. People on the sidewalk stared. She ignored them, leaning against the car for a moment, trying to anchor herself. The Lincoln was stuck, immobile. She couldn't stay here. Her mind, trained for years to assess crises, latched onto a single logical solution. The subway? The 6 train entrance was just half a block away. It was underground, anonymous, a way to move. She could get to a hospital, to a doctor, away from the prying eyes. It was a flawed, desperate plan, born of panic and disorientation. Call my assistant, she managed to say to Jerry, whose face was pale with worry. Tell her I'm unwell. I'm taking the subway. Miss Vance, no. Let me... But she was already moving, pushing herself away from the car and weaving into the crowd on the sidewalk. Her vision tunneled, the faces around her becoming a blur of indifferent features. Her designer heels clicked unsteadily on the concrete. Each step sent a fresh jolt of pain through her chest and arm. The famous face, usually a passport through any crowd, now went unnoticed, just another New Yorker in a hurry. She descended the stairs into the 23rd Street station, the air growing hotter and thicker with each step. The familiar, grimy tile walls seemed to close in on her. The roar of an approaching train echoed through the tunnel, a deafening, monstrous sound. She fumbled in her purse for her Metro card, her fingers numb and uncooperative. The pressure in her head was immense, a drumbeat of pure agony. She made it through the turnstile, her legs buckling slightly. The platform was crowded, a wall of bodies waiting for the next train. She needed to sit down. She needed help. She looked around, her vision swimming. Dozens of people, all absorbed in their phones, their books, their own lives. No one looked at her. No one saw the terror in her eyes. Excuse me, she whispered, but the sound was lost in the din of the station. I need... The world dissolved into a swirl of fractured light and sound. The pain in her chest crested into an unbearable wave. Her legs gave way completely. The script for The Vance Point fluttered from her grasp, pages scattering across the dirty concrete. Elena Vance, the woman who commanded the attention of millions every night, collapsed in a heap on the grimy floor of the subway station. A soft, pained sigh escaped her lips as darkness swallowed her whole. On the 38th floor of the Global Tech Tower, Michael was sitting in a sleek, minimalist waiting area, trying to slow his breathing. He'd checked in with the receptionist, a young woman with a perfectly placid smile who had told him, Ms. Davison will be with you shortly. The phrase shortly was its own special kind of torture. Every second that ticked by felt like another layer of sweat drying into his shirt, another wrinkle setting permanently into his suit. He rehearsed his answers in his head, but the phrases felt hollow and rehearsed. I see myself growing with Global Tech. Would they even want a 45-year-old man to grow? Wouldn't they prefer a fresh, cheap MBA straight out of college? He looked around the office. It was an open-plan paradise of glass and light. Young, vibrant employees sat at ergonomic workstations, collaborating in soundproof pods or sipping coffee from sleek mugs. They all looked so effortless. He felt like a relic, a dinosaur who had stumbled into the future. The receptionist's phone buzzed softly. She listened for a moment, then looked up at Michael. Mr. Thorne? Ms. Davison is ready for you. It's the first door on your right, just through the glass corridor. This was it. The moment of truth. He stood up, his legs stiff. He gave his jacket one last futile tug and walked towards the glass corridor, his heart a frantic drum in his ears. He was so focused on the door ahead, on the interview that would decide his and Lily's future, that he barely registered the cityscape visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows to his left. But something made him pause, a flicker of movement, a disruption in the orderly flow of the city far below. He glanced down, his eyes automatically tracking down 40 stories to the street grid. His gaze swept over the ant-like cars, the tiny people, and then snagged on the entrance to the 23rd Street subway station. It was too far to see any detail, but there was a strange, stagnant knot of people on the sidewalk near the entrance, a break in the usual flow of pedestrian traffic. It was odd but meaningless. A tourist asking for directions, a street performer, a fight. The city was full of such tiny, insignificant dramas. He turned away, his focus snapping back to the door marked Janice Davison, Director of Talent Acquisition. He took one last deep breath, reached for the handle, and stepped inside. The interview room was small and windowless, dominated by a white table. A woman in her late 40s with a severe blonde bob and a sharp black suit sat waiting. She did not smile. "Mr. Thorne, please have a seat. I was beginning to think you weren't coming." The words were polite, but the subtext was a blade. Michael's face flushed. "My apologies, Ms. Davison. The subway system—" She held up a hand. "Let's begin, shall we? We have a lot to cover." She opened a folder with his resume inside. It looked pitifully thin on the stark white table. For the next 20 minutes, Michael fought a different kind of battle. He parried her pointed questions about the gaps in his employment history, trying to frame his time as a caregiver as a period of developing unparalleled resilience and time management skills. He talked about his past experience in data analysis, but the software he'd mastered was now likely obsolete. He could see the subtle flickers of disinterest in her eyes, the polite nods that didn't reach them. He was failing. He could feel it. The lifeline was slipping through his fingers. Finally, Ms. Davison closed the folder. "Thank you, Michael. We have several other candidates to see this week. You'll hear from us one way or the other." It was the classic kiss of death. The handshake she offered was brief and cool. He was being ushered out, the interview cut short. The obstacle of his own life had been insurmountable. He walked back through the glass corridor in a daze, the gleaming, prosperous world of global tech already feeling like a dream from which he'd been violently awakened. He was a ghost here. He rode the elevator down in silence, surrounded by the quiet hum of success, feeling its weight crush him. Back in the grand lobby, he barely registered the security guard's nod. He pushed through the revolving doors and emerged back onto 42nd Street. The noise and the heat welcomed him back to his reality. The interview was over. He had, for all intents and purposes, lost. The goal that had given his morning structure and terrifying purpose was gone, leaving a hollow, aching void. What was he going to tell Lily? He walked aimlessly, his shoulders slumped. The adrenaline that had fueled his run was gone, replaced by a leaden fatigue. He needed to get home. He needed to figure out what to do next. He descended back into the earth, into the 42nd Street Grand Central Station, a cavernous, teeming hub of humanity. The station was its usual chaos, a roaring river of commuters, tourists, and homeless people, all flowing in conflicting directions. The air was thick with the smell of diesel from the trains, roasted nuts, and unwashed bodies. He navigated on autopilot, heading for the 7 train that would connect him to the L back to Brooklyn. His mind was a storm of recrimination and fear, replaying every fumbled answer, every polite, dismissive nod from Janice Davison. He was passing through a wide, tiled corridor, a less congested feeder tunnel, when a small, gathered crowd caught his eye. It was a common sight. Someone had probably collapsed from the heat, or a drunk had passed out. People were slowing, gawking for a moment with a mixture of morbid curiosity and urban indifference, then moving on. It was New York's unwritten rule: don't get involved. Michael intended to do the same. He had his own catastrophe to manage. But as he drew closer, his gaze, sharpened by a day of hypervigilance, caught on the details the others missed. This wasn't a homeless person. The clothes were too expensive, a silk blouse, tailored trousers. The shoes were designer, one of them lying off to the side where it had slipped off. And then he saw the face, pale and unconscious, turned towards the grimy floor. It was a face he saw every night on the evening news while Lily did her homework. A face known for its intelligence and composure, now slack and vulnerable. It was Elena Vance, and she was utterly, completely alone on the cold, dirty floor as the river of humanity parted and flowed around her. Oblivious, for a single suspended heartbeat, Michael's entire world narrowed to two opposing poles. 40 blocks north, in a sterile room on the 38th floor, sat his future, his daughter's new shoes, the end of the gnawing fear in his gut. It was receding with every second, a ship sailing away without him. And here at his feet lay a woman, a famous, powerful stranger whose world had collapsed onto the filthy, gum-stained floor of a subway corridor. His own desperation screamed at him to move. Go, run! Maybe you can still make it. Maybe you can explain. Maybe. The mantra of his morning, get the job, get the job, get the job, was a drumbeat in his skull. He took half a step, his body physically straining toward the distant promise of the Global Tech Tower. But his feet wouldn't follow. They were rooted to the spot. He looked at Elena Vance. Her famous face, usually composed and authoritative on the television screen, was a ghastly shade of gray. Her lips were slightly parted, her breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches. A string of expensive pearls was tangled and pressed awkwardly against her neck. The crowd, a typical New York mosaic of self-interest, parted around her like water around a stone. A teenager snapped a picture with his phone. A woman in a business suit clucked her tongue in pity, but didn't break stride. Another man muttered, probably drunk, and kept walking. The collective indifference was a physical force, a chilling wind that blew through Michael's own self-absorption. He saw Lily's face then, not as a motivator for his ambition, but as his conscience. What would he tell her if he walked away? That daddy was late for a meeting, so he left a sick woman on the ground? The simple black and white morality of a 7-year-old shamed the complex, compromised arithmetic of his own survival. Ah, hell, he whispered, the words a soft surrender. The decision was made. The interview was gone. The hope was gone. A strange, hollow calm settled over him, the quiet after a storm of panic. The frantic energy that had propelled him through the morning evaporated, leaving behind only a weary, grim resolve. He dropped his worn leather portfolio, the symbol of his futile quest, onto the floor with a soft thud and knelt beside her, his creaky knees protesting against the hard concrete. "Ma'am, Miss Vance, can you hear me?" he said, his voice low and firm, cutting through the ambient noise of the station. There was no response. He felt for a pulse in her wrist, his own fingers trembling. It was there. A faint, frantic flutter against his fingertips, a trapped bird beating against a cage. He wasn't a doctor, but he knew this was bad. The pain etched on her unconscious face, the pallor, the clutching gesture her hand had made before she fell. It all screamed one thing: heart. "Somebody call 911, he barked, his voice sharper and more commanding than it had been all day. The authority in it surprised him. It was the voice of a father, a man used to taking charge in a crisis, even if his own life was in shambles. A few people paused. A young woman with a backpack fumbled for her phone. "I'm on it," she said, her eyes wide. Michael shrugged out of his cheap suit jacket, wadding it up and gently sliding it under Elena's head, a pathetic cushion against the grimy floor. He loosened the silk scarf at her neck, his movements careful, reverent. He was acutely aware of his own shabbiness in contrast to her expensive clothes. His frayed shirt cuff brushed against her cheek. "Ambulance is on its way," the girl with the phone said, her voice shaking. "They said keep her talking if she's conscious." But she wasn't. Michael stayed on his knees, a lone sentinel in the flowing river of humanity. He created a small, fragile circle of care around her, his body a barrier against the gawkers. He kept his hand on her wrist, monitoring that thready pulse, talking to her in a low, steady murmur, not knowing if she could hear him. "It's okay," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Help is coming. Just hang on. You're going to be okay." He was reassuring himself as much as her. The words felt like a lie. Nothing was okay. His chance was gone, and this woman was fighting for her life. The distant wail of a siren grew steadily louder, a piercing promise of professional help. Soon, a team of EMTs in dark blue uniforms burst into the corridor, a whirlwind of efficiency with a gurney and heavy equipment cases. They moved with a practiced, brusque grace that pushed Michael unceremoniously aside. "Sir, we'll take it from here." "What can you tell us?" One of them, a woman with a tight braid and sharp eyes, asked as she checked Elena's vitals. Michael stood back, feeling suddenly useless, his suit jacket left behind like a discarded rag. He relayed what he knew in a few clipped sentences. He'd found her. She was unresponsive. Her pulse was weak and fast. He mentioned who she was, and a flicker of recognition passed over the EMT's face, but it didn't change her methodical actions. They had her on the gurney, an oxygen mask over her face. An IV started in a matter of moments. The lead EMT turned to Michael. "You coming with?" "You're her?" He wasn't anything. He was a stranger. He was a man who had just thrown his future away for a principal. He looked at Elena Vance, so small and vulnerable on the stretcher, utterly alone in this massive, indifferent city. He thought of the vultures, the paparazzi, who would surely descend the moment this news broke. She had no one. "Yeah," Michael heard himself say, his voice hoarse. "I'm with her." He scooped up his portfolio, a now meaningless artifact, and followed the gurney as they wheeled it swiftly through the station, clearing a path with loud, firm commands. The crowd, now more substantial, parted for them, a sea of smartphones recording the entire thing. He kept his head down, his face burning with a confused mix of shame and purpose. They emerged into the blinding afternoon sun on 23rd Street. The ambulance was idling at the curb, its lights painting the surrounding buildings in frantic pulses of red. The EMTs loaded the gurney into the back with a smooth, practiced click. "St. Vincent's is closest," the EMT with the braid said, jerking her head for Michael to get in. He climbed into the back of the ambulance, a space that was both claustrophobic and full of a terrifying, humming energy. The doors slammed shut, sealing them in. The siren kicked in again, a deafening wall of sound just inches from his head. The vehicle lurched forward, weaving through traffic with an aggressive urgency. Michael sat on a small jump seat, strapped in, watching the EMTs work. They spoke in a rapid-fire code of acronyms and numbers, their hands moving constantly, attaching leads to her chest, monitoring the squiggling lines on a portable machine. He was an intruder in this medical drama, a spectator to a life hanging in the balance. The smell of antiseptic and plastic filled his nostrils, overwhelming the lingering scent of his own sweat and the city's grime. He watched the city fly by through the small back windows, a chaotic blur of traffic and people, all living their normal lives, completely unaware of the small, life-and-death capsule hurtling through their midst. He thought of the Global Tech Tower, now just a part of that skyline. He thought of Janice Davison, probably already interviewing the next candidate, some bright, young, unrumpled thing who hadn't been waylaid by a collapsing news anchor. A cold, hard knot of certainty formed in his stomach. He had made his choice. There was no going back. The goal that had defined his existence for weeks was gone, obliterated by a single act of basic human decency. The obstacle hadn't been his age, or his resume, or the delayed train. The final insurmountable obstacle had been his own conscience. The ambulance screeched to a halt at the emergency room entrance. The doors flew open, and a team of hospital staff took over, transferring Elena from the gurney to a hospital bed with a seamless, terrifying efficiency. They rushed her through the automatic double doors, the words, "Cardiac Team Stat," echoing in the tiled hallway. Michael was left standing in the bustling, chaotic ER lobby, adrift. The sudden silence, after the siren's scream, was disorienting. The smell was different here, less urgent, more institutional, floor wax, stale coffee, and the faint, sweet scent of sickness. A nurse at the triage desk looked up at him. "Are you family?" "No," Michael said, his voice rough. I found her. I came with the ambulance. She's in good hands." "You can wait over there if you want," the nurse said, her attention already shifting to the next person in line. He stumbled to a bank of hard plastic chairs in a corner of the waiting room. The adrenaline that had carried him through the crisis was gone, leaving him utterly drained. He slumped into a chair, the cheap plastic groaning under his weight. He looked at his hands. They were shaking. He still had a smudge of grime from the subway floor on his knuckle. He had done the right thing. He knew it with a certainty that went bone deep, but knowing that didn't fill the hollow, aching void that was now his future. It didn't pay the rent. It didn't buy Lily new shoes. He sat there for what felt like an eternity, watching the clock on the wall. It was a cheap, functional clock with a white face and black hands, utterly indifferent to the human dramas unfolding beneath it. He watched the minute hand jerk forward with a soft, relentless click. 9:45, the delayed train. 10:04, his arrival, too late. 10:30, the interview would have been starting. 11:15, it would be ending now. He had sacrificed everything for a stranger, and as he sat in the germ-filled stillness of the hospital waiting room, the full weight of that sacrifice finally crashed down upon him. He had lost. There was no other word for it. With a slow, mechanical movement, as if his arm weighed 100 pounds, he pushed back the sleeve of his wrinkled, sweat-stained shirt. He looked down at the cheap digital watch with its cracked face, the final arbiter of his morning's desperate race. The numbers glowed back at him, a simple, brutal, and absolute verdict. 11:27. The interview was long over. The sterile silence of the hospital waiting room was a physical weight. It pressed down on Michael, amplifying the frantic, chaotic drumming inside his chest that had nothing to do with his sprint across Midtown. The cheap plastic chair groaned under his slight shifts in weight, each sound a gunshot in the hushed space. He stared at the scuffed linoleum floor, seeing not the geometric pattern of faded tiles, but the cold, accusatory face of his digital watch. 11:27. The interview was over. He had sacrificed it on the altar of a basic human decency he hadn't known he still possessed. The hollow ache in his stomach was no longer from hunger. It was the void left by a collapsed future. He pictured Lily's face, the unwavering faith in her. "You'll get it, Daddy," and a wave of nausea so potent he had to close his eyes. What was he going to tell her? That Daddy had been late because he'd stopped to help a famous lady? It sounded like the lamest, most pathetic excuse in the world, a lie concocted by a failure. The obstacle had never been the city, or his age, or his frayed cuffs. It had been his own damned conscience. He had to call. The thought was a sliver of glass in his mind. He had to explain, to grovel, to somehow salvage the unsalvageable. Maybe if he could just talk to someone, make them understand about the subway, about the collapse, about the human being on the floor. His hand trembled as he pulled the cheap, outdated flip phone from his pants pocket. The leather-bound portfolio, his pathetic shield, lay at his feet like a dead thing. He found the number for Global Tech's main line, the one he'd memorized weeks ago. Each press of the button was an effort. He held the phone to his ear, the dial tone a monotonous drone that seemed to mock his desperation. "Global Tech, how may I direct your call?" A crisp female voice answered, so polished and efficient it made him flinch. "Yes, hello," he began, his voice rough, scraping against the quiet of the waiting room. He cleared his throat, trying to force it into some semblance of professionalism. "My name is Michael Thorne. I had a 10 a.m. interview with Janice Davison in HR. I need to speak with her, please. It's urgent. One moment, please." The hold music was a snippet of soulless, ambient electronica. He watched the clock. 11:29. Each tick of the second hand was a nail in his coffin. He could feel the eyes of a tired-looking man across from him, a woman rocking a fussy infant, but he kept his gaze fixed on the floor. The line clicked. "Mr. Thorne?" It was a different voice now, colder, flatter. Janice Davison's assistant, perhaps. "Yes, speaking. I am so sorry about this morning. There was an emergency, a medical emergency, in the subway. I was the first one to find a woman who had collapsed, and I had to stay with her until the ambulance came. I know it's no excuse for missing the interview, but I was hoping there might be any possibility of rescheduling." The words tumbled out in a rushed, pathetic jumble. He heard the pleading in his own voice and hated it. There was a long pause on the other end, a silence filled with judgment. "Ms. Davison's schedule is completely booked for the next 2 weeks. And frankly, Mr. Thorne, punctuality is a core value at Global Tech. We have a very rigorous candidate pipeline." The finality in her tone was absolute. It was over. The lifeline had not just slipped away. It had been deliberately cut. "I understand," he whispered, the fight draining out of him completely. "Thank you for your time." He was about to snap the phone shut, to surrender to the crushing weight of his failure, when the voice on the other end spoke again, a note of almost offhand curiosity in her voice. "You said a medical emergency? Who was it?" The question was so unexpected, so voyeuristic, it threw him. It was Elena Vance, the news anchor. Another pause, this one qualitatively different. Sharper. Elena Vance? From the Vance Point? Yes. Hold the line, Mr. Thorne. He was put on hold again, the ambient music returning. What was happening? Why did it matter? He watched a doctor stride through the waiting room, his white coat flapping, his face a mask of focused impatience. Michael felt like an imposter in this world of action and purpose. The line clicked back, but this time it was a man's voice. It was deeper, older, with a gravelly, self-assured quality that brooked no nonsense. Thorne, this is Joseph Harrison, head of strategic communications. Michael's breath hitched. Harrison. The name was vaguely familiar from his pre-interview research. A veteran at the company, known for his old-school connections. A powerful man. Mr. Harrison? Michael managed, sitting up straighter in the uncomfortable chair. My assistant tells me you were with Elena Vance when she collapsed. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, an assessment. Yes, sir. I found her. I rode in the ambulance with her to St. Vincent's. She's here now in the ER. What's her condition? Harrison's voice was intense, devoid of pleasantries. I don't know. They took her straight back. No one's told me anything. I'm not family. Listen to me, Thorne. Harrison's tone became low, conspiratorial. Elena is a close personal friend of the board. This is a very sensitive situation. The media can't get wind of this, not until we have a clear picture. A vacuum of information is a dangerous thing for a company like ours. Michael was lost. What did any of this have to do with his interview? I understand, sir. Do you? Harrison paused, and Michael could almost hear the gears turning in the man's head. You're there, on the ground. You're a witness. Janice told me your interview was a no-show, but this changes the context. A tiny, impossible flicker of hope sparked in the vast darkness of Michael's despair. He clutched the phone tighter, his knuckles white. My daughter. I have a daughter, sir. I was desperate to make that interview. The subway was a nightmare, and then I found Ms. Vance. I couldn't just leave her. He tried to keep the raw need out of his voice, to sound like a responsible man reporting a fact, not a beggar pleading for scraps. A family man. Good. Harrison sounded pleased, as if Michael had passed a test he didn't know he was taking. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to stay right where you are. You're going to find out everything you can about her condition. Who her doctor is, the prognosis, everything. You are now, for all intents and purposes, a global tech liaison on this matter. Michael's mind reeled. A liaison? He was a failed data analyst, a man who slept on a lumpy couch. But my interview... Forget the interview. Harrison cut him off, his voice sharp. This is more important. You do this right, you keep me informed, and we'll see about finding a place for you. I have discretionary hiring power. Nepotism isn't a dirty word if it serves the company's interests, Thorne. Do we understand each other? The spark of hope erupted into a roaring, terrifying flame. It was a chance. A twisted, bizarre, and morally ambiguous chance, but it was a chance. Harrison was leveraging a woman's medical crisis for corporate PR, and he was offering Michael a seat on that grimy lifeboat. The obstacle of his failure was suddenly replaced by a new, more complex obstacle. His own scruples. Could he do this? Could he use Elena Vance's suffering as a stepping stone? He saw Lily's smile. He felt the accusatory springs of the couch in his back. He smelled the damp in his apartment. The decision was made in an instant. Yes, sir. I understand perfectly. Good man. Call this number directly with any updates. Harrison recited a mobile number, which Michael scrambled to jot down on a crumpled receipt from his pocket. I'll be waiting. The line went dead. Michael sat there, the phone still pressed to his ear, the dial tone buzzing like a trapped insect. He had a new goal. It was terrifyingly simple. Be Joseph Harrison's eyes and ears. The obstacle was the hospital bureaucracy, the privacy laws, his own status as a nobody. He stood up, his legs unsteady. He had to find someone, a nurse, a doctor, anyone who could tell him something. He approached the triage desk, where the same nurse was typing furiously. Excuse me, he said, his voice firmer now, infused with a purpose he didn't truly feel. Any update on Elena Vance? I came in with her. The nurse didn't look up. Are you family? I'm with her company, Global Tech. It's a matter of some urgency regarding her public profile. The lie felt greasy on his tongue. That got her attention. She looked up, her eyes skeptical. I can't give out patient information to you, sir. You'll have to wait for the doctor. Can you at least tell me if she's stable? When a doctor might be out? Her employer is very concerned. Before the nurse could answer, his phone vibrated in his hand. It was the number Harrison had just given him. His heart leaped into his throat. He fumbled the phone open. Thorne? Yes, sir. Change of plan. Get back here. Now. Harrison's voice was tight, urgent. Back to Global Tech? But I thought you wanted me to stay, to find out. The situation is evolving. There's a window, my window. I need you in my office in 30 minutes. Can you do that? Michael's mind raced. Leave Elena? Abandon his post after just accepting the mission? But this was the man who held his future in his hands. This was the only window that mattered. Yes, I'm on my way. Don't be late this time. The line went dead. Panic, that old familiar companion, returned with a vengeance. 30 minutes. From St. Vincent's in the Village to the Global Tech Tower in Midtown. In the state of his suit, with his disheveled hair and sweat-stained shirt, he looked towards the double doors leading to the ER, to where Elena Vance was fighting for her life. A profound guilt twisted in his gut. He was abandoning her. Again, he was making a choice for himself, for Lily, over a stranger. He rushed back to the triage desk, scrawling his name and number on another scrap of paper. Please, he said to the nurse, his voice cracking with a sincerity that was finally, fully real. If there's any change, any news at all, please call me. She shouldn't be alone. The nurse took the paper with a non-committal nod and went back to her typing. He didn't allow himself another second to think. He turned and ran out of the waiting room, back into the chaotic pulse of the city. The afternoon sun was high and bright. He hailed the first cab he saw, a yellow checker cab that looked as ancient and weary as he felt. Global Tech Tower, 42nd and Lex, as fast as you can, he gasped, sliding into the worn vinyl back seat that smelled of pine air freshener and old cigarettes. The cabbie, a man with a thick accent and a weary shrug, merely nodded. Traffic is bad, my friend. It was. They crawled north, block by agonizing block. Michael watched the meter tick upwards, each cent a tiny hemorrhage from his dwindling savings. He checked his watch every 30 seconds. 12:05, 12:08, 12:12. He rehearsed what he would say to Harrison, but his mind was a blank. What could he possibly offer? He had no new information. He was a messenger with no message. The cab finally pulled up to the curb in front of the shimmering tower. Michael thrust a wad of crumpled bills at the driver, not waiting for the change, and burst out onto the sidewalk. He was back. The same revolving doors, the same immense lobby, the same cool, conditioned air. But everything was different. He wasn't the hopeful, nervous candidate anymore. He was a pawn in a game he didn't understand, summoned by a kingmaker for reasons he couldn't fathom. His goal was no longer to impress HR with his data analysis skills. It was to satisfy the obscure, urgent demand of Joseph Harrison. He bypassed the security desk, holding up his temporary badge from the morning, now looking even more ridiculous and out of place. O'Malley gave him a long, slow look, but said nothing. Michael moved toward the elevator banks, his heart hammering. He was sweating again, the damp patches under his arms spreading, his hair a mess. He looked like a man who had been through a war. He found the bank for the executive floors and pressed the call button. The elevator arrived, its doors sliding open with a hushed, expensive sigh. He stepped inside, alone once more, and watched his frantic, disheveled reflection in the mirrored walls as he ascended to the rarefied air of the 50th floor. The doors opened onto a different world. The 38th floor had been sleek and modern. This was opulent and traditional. Thick, sound-absorbing carpet in a deep navy covered the floor. The walls were paneled in dark wood, and original abstract expressionist paintings hung in soft pools of gallery light. The air was still and silent, heavy with the scent of leather and old money. A single massive mahogany desk stood guard at the end of a short corridor, behind which sat a severe-looking woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled into a tight chignon. She looked up as he approached, her eyes doing a swift, disapproving inventory of his appearance. "Michael Thorne for Joseph Harrison," he said, his voice echoing too loudly in the quiet. "Mr. Harrison is expecting you," she said, her tone implying he was the last person on earth she would admit to this sanctum. She pressed a button on her phone. "Sir, Mr. Thorne is here." She listened for a moment, then gestured to a heavy oak door to her left. "You may go in." Michael's mouth was dry. He wiped his palms on his wrinkled trousers, took a deep breath that did nothing to calm the frantic beating of his heart, and pushed the door open. He stepped into a corner office that seemed to be made entirely of light and sky. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking, panoramic view of the Manhattan skyline. The room was vast, dominated by a desk the size of a small boat. And behind it, silhouetted against the immense window, stood Joseph Harrison. He was a bull of a man in his late 50s, with a thick head of steel-gray hair and a broad, powerful frame encased in a suit that probably cost more than Michael's last 6 months of rent. He turned as Michael entered, his eyes, a piercing, cold blue, sweeping over him from head to toe, taking in every detail of his disgraceful state. Michael stood there, frozen on the threshold, his portfolio hanging limply from his hand. He was inside. He had made it. But as Harrison's gaze finished its assessment, a small, almost imperceptible frown of distaste touched the man's lips. The goal was within sight, but the final, most daunting obstacle stood right in front of him: the judgment of the man who held all the power. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind Michael, sealing him in a tomb of conditioned air and immense, silent power. Joseph Harrison remained standing, a broad silhouette against the sprawling canvas of the Manhattan skyline. He didn't move, didn't speak, merely allowed his presence to fill the vast space, a predator assessing unfamiliar prey that had stumbled into its territory. The silence stretched, thin and sharp as a razor, amplifying the frantic thud of Michael's heart against his ribs. He stood just inside the doorway, his worn leather portfolio feeling like a child's toy in his hand. The opulence of the room was a physical assault after the grimy chaos of the subway and the sterile anxiety of the hospital. The deep navy carpet seemed to swallow sound, the dark wood paneling absorbed the light, and the city spread out beyond the glass was a dizzying, indifferent panorama of success he could never hope to touch. He was acutely, painfully aware of his own dishevelment, the sweat-stained shirt, the rumpled suit, the hair plastered to his forehead with the grime of a desperate day. Finally, Harrison moved. He didn't walk. He prowled around the edge of the colossal desk, his movements fluid and controlled. He came to a stop a few feet from Michael, close enough for Michael to smell the faint, expensive scent of sandalwood and clean wool. Those cold blue eyes performed a second, more thorough inspection, lingering on the frayed cuff of Michael's shirt, the scuff on his cheap dress shoes, the tremor he couldn't quite still in his hand. "Thorne," Harrison said. His voice was a low rumble devoid of warmth. It wasn't a greeting. It was a label. "Mr. Harrison," Michael managed, his own voice sounding rough and out of place. You wanted to see me." "I did." Harrison gestured with a thick, manicured hand towards a pair of low-slung leather armchairs facing the desk. They looked more like works of art than furniture. "Sit." Michael moved stiffly, lowering himself into the chair. The soft leather sighed, enveloping him, making him feel small. Harrison remained standing, leaning back against the front of his desk, looming over him. "You cost me a significant amount of time today, Thorne," Harrison began, his tone conversational, yet edged with steel. "Janice Davison is a busy woman. Her time is a company resource. You wasted it." The accusation, delivered so bluntly, sent a fresh wave of heat to Michael's face. This was it. The reprimand. The dismissal. He had to explain. He had to make this powerful, cynical man understand that it wasn't a choice. It was a compulsion. "I know, sir. And I am profoundly sorry for the inconvenience. But I swear it wasn't by choice. There was an incident." Harrison's eyebrow twitched, a minute gesture of profound skepticism. "An incident? Yes, sir. In the subway. After my train was delayed, I was transferring at 14th Street, and a woman collapsed, right there on the platform. No one was stopping. Everyone was just walking past her." The memory flashed before his eyes, the expensive shoe lying off to the side, the pale, famous face against the dirty floor. The words began to tumble out, fueled by a need to be believed. I couldn't just leave her there. She was unconscious. I thought she was having a heart attack. I stayed with her. I called 911. I rode with her in the ambulance to St. Vincent's. That's where I was when you called. That's why I missed the interview," he finished, his chest heaving slightly. He had laid it all out, the raw, unvarnished truth. He looked up at Harrison, hoping to see a flicker of understanding, a shred of human empathy in those impenetrable eyes. Instead, Joseph Harrison let out a short, sharp bark of laughter. It was a dry, humorless sound, like stones rattling in a tin can. "You have got to be kidding me," Harrison said, a wide, cynical smile spreading across his face. He pushed himself off the desk and began to pace slowly in front of the windows, a panther in a cage. "That is the most pathetic, contrived, Hallmark movie excuse for professional incompetence I have ever heard in my 40 years in this business." "A woman collapsed? You played hero in the subway?" He stopped and turned, his smile vanishing, replaced by a mask of cold contempt. "Did you really think that would work? That I'd be so charmed by your little story of civic duty that I'd overlook the fact that you failed the most basic test of reliability?" The words hit Michael like a series of physical blows. He felt the air leave his lungs. He had been prepared for rejection, but not for this. This utter evisceration of his truth, this mocking dismissal of the most morally clear decision he had made in years. "It's not a story," Michael said, his voice low but gaining strength. "It's the truth. It was Elena Vance, the news anchor." Harrison froze. For a fraction of a second, a flicker of something, recognition, calculation, passed behind his eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a deeper, more theatrical scorn. "Elena Vance?" he repeated, his voice dripping with feigned amazement. "Oh, that's rich. You expect me to believe that you, of all people, stumbled upon a national television personality in medical distress and became her knight in shining, albeit rumpled armor?" He gestured dismissively at Michael's suit. "Let me guess. You're also going to tell me she regained consciousness, thanked you profusely, and offered you a job as her personal assistant." Michael's hands clenched into fists on his knees. The condescension was a corrosive acid, eating away at his composure. He thought of Lily, of her simple, unwavering faith. He thought of the feel of Elena Vance's thready pulse beneath his fingers, the absolute solitude of her on that dirty floor. This man, in his tower of glass and steel, was spitting on that reality. He was reducing an act of desperate compassion to a strategic lie. "She was unconscious the entire time," Michael said, his voice hardening. He straightened his spine, pushing back against the enveloping leather of the chair. "I didn't do it for a reward. I didn't do it for a story. I did it because she was a human being who needed help, and no one else was stopping." Harrison waved a hand, a gesture of supreme irritation. "Spare me the Boy Scout oath, Thorne. The fact remains that you were late. At Global Tech, we have a zero-tolerance policy for tardiness. It's not a guideline. It's a core principle. It speaks to discipline, to respect, to planning, qualities you have demonstrably failed to exhibit." He walked back behind his desk and picked up a thin file, Michael's file. He flipped it open with a contemptuous flick of his wrist. "Let's look at the facts, shall we? 45. A 5-year gap in your resume you euphemistically call a period of familial focus, a series of short-term, low-level contract jobs. You are not a prime candidate, Thorne. You were a courtesy, a box to be checked. Your failure to arrive on time simply confirmed what this resume already screams. You are unreliable. You are not Global Tech material." Each word was a hammer blow, nailing the coffin of his aspirations shut. The cold, hard assessment of his life, laid bare on this expensive desk, was more brutal than any eviction notice. This was a judgment on his entire existence. The obstacle wasn't just the missed interview. It was the sum total of his failures, as curated and presented by Joseph Harrison. But something strange was happening inside Michael. The initial shock and shame were burning away, replaced by a slow, steady burn of anger. This man, with all his power and privilege, saw the world as a series of transactions and strategies. He couldn't comprehend an action that wasn't calculated for personal gain. In his cynicism, he had stripped Michael of his dignity, his truth, and his chance. And in doing so, he had unintentionally given Michael a terrible, clarifying freedom. He had nothing left to lose. Michael rose from the chair. He wasn't tall, but he drew himself up to his full height, his shoulders squaring. The movement felt foreign, and muscle long unused. "You can say I'm not qualified. You can say I'm too old. You can say my resume is a mess," Michael said, his voice quiet but clear, cutting through Harrison's bluster. "But you do not get to tell me what I did or did not do this morning. You weren't there. You didn't see her. You didn't feel her pulse fading under your fingers while 100 people walked by like she was a piece of trash." Harrison's eyes widened slightly, surprised by the pushback. "I don't have to listen to this. You wanted a liaison?" Michael continued, the words coming now in a hot, steady stream. "You wanted eyes and ears? Fine. Here's my report. Elena Vance is probably fighting for her life in a hospital room right now, alone. Because the world is full of people like you who think stopping to help another person is an excuse for being late. You talk about core principles? What about humanity? What about basic decency? Or is that not a valuable enough quality for your talent pipeline?" He was breathing heavily now, his heart pounding not with fear, but with a raw, righteous fury. The compassion he had shown in the subway, the love that fueled his desperation for this job, it had all coalesced into a strength he didn't know he possessed. It hadn't weakened him, it had forged him. For the first time in 3 years, he wasn't pleading. He was stating a fact. The change in the room's atmosphere was palpable. The quiet opulence now felt charged, dangerous. Harrison's face, previously a mask of condescending amusement, had darkened. A vein throbbed faintly at his temple. The insolence of this ragged nobody challenging him in his own sanctuary was an unpardonable sin. "How dare you?" Harrison whispered, the words laced with venom. He took a step forward, his large frame suddenly intimidating. "You come into my office, reeking of failure and self-pity. You spin me some maudlin fairy tale, and then you have the audacity to lecture me on morality?" "I'm just telling you the truth you asked for," Michael shot back, holding his ground. "You just don't like the shape of it. The only truth here is that you are a man who made a choice," Harrison snarled, jabbing a finger in Michael's direction. "You chose to be a good Samaritan over being a professional, and now you have to live with the consequences of that choice. There is no place for you here. Not now. Not ever." He glared at Michael, his chest rising and falling with barely suppressed rage. The confrontation had escalated far beyond a simple hiring decision. It was a clash of worlds, of values, and Michael had, for a fleeting moment, drawn blood. Harrison's eyes, cold and furious, swept over Michael one last time, as if memorizing the face of this insubordinate insect. He made his decision. "This conversation is over," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. He reached for the intercom button on his desk phone, his thumb hovering over it. "I think it's time you were escorted from the premises." The threat hung in the air, cold and final. Security, the ultimate dismissal. To be physically removed, like a trespasser, a criminal. The shame of it would be absolute. It would be the final stamp on his record of failure, a story he could never tell Lily. Michael stood his ground, his jaw clenched, his heart a wild drum in the sudden ringing silence. He had lost the job. He had lost his chance. But as he watched Harrison's thumb press down on the intercom button, he knew with a terrifying clarity that he had regained something else, something he thought he'd lost forever, his own self-respect. The intercom buzzed once, a sharp electronic sound that seemed to seal his fate. Harrison leaned toward the speaker, his eyes locked on Michael's, a triumphant, cruel glint in their blue depths. "Margaret," he said, his voice crisp and cold. "Send in security." The electronic buzz of the intercom was the sound of a guillotine dropping. Michael stood frozen, Joseph Harrison's cold, triumphant gaze pinning him to the opulent carpet. He could hear the faint, tinny voice of the silver-haired secretary through the speaker. "Yes, Mr. Harrison." Harrison's lips were a thin, cruel line. "Margaret, send in security, please. We have an uninvited guest who needs to be escorted out." The words, uninvited guest, hung in the air, a final, humiliating brand. All the fight, the righteous anger that had momentarily filled him, evaporated, leaving behind a cold, hollow shell. He had lost, not just the job, but his dignity. To be physically removed by security, It was the ultimate confirmation of his failure, a story that would be etched into his soul, one he could never, ever share with Lily. He didn't wait for the guards. He turned, his movements stiff and automatic, and pulled open the heavy oak door. He didn't look back at Harrison, at the skyline, at the symbol of a world that had so decisively spat him out. He walked past the secretary's desk, her eyes averted in a practiced mask of non-seeing, and moved back toward the elevator bank. His footsteps were silent on the deep pile carpet, a ghost already retreating. The elevator ride down was a descent into a different kind of silence, the silence of utter defeat. The mirrored walls showed a man he barely recognized, pale, rumpled, his eyes haunted. He watched the numbers descend, 50, 45, 38, a countdown to the resumption of his hopeless life. The doors opened onto the grand lobby. He saw O'Malley at the security desk look up, his expression shifting from neutrality to a flicker of pity. That pity was worse than Harrison's contempt. Michael walked through the revolving doors, and the summer heat felt like a slap. The noise of 42nd Street, which had seemed like momentum hours ago, was now just a cacophonous roar of a city that had chewed him up and discarded him. He didn't run for the subway this time. He walked, his shoulders slumped, each step a heavy, plodding acknowledgement of his reality. The journey back to Brooklyn was a blur of grimy windows and anonymous faces. He was a shell, his mind replaying the confrontation on a loop, Harrison's mocking laugh, the dismissal of his story, the final searing command for security. He had chosen decency over ambition, and the price was everything. He pushed open the door to his studio apartment. The air was still and thick, smelling of old coffee and damp. The silence was deafening. Aunt Carol had taken Lily out, probably to the park, a small mercy for which he was pathetically grateful. He couldn't have faced her, not yet. He shrugged off the ruined suit jacket, letting it fall to the floor in a heap. The tie followed. He poured the last of the bitter, cold coffee from the morning into his chipped mug and drank it in one long, grimacing gulp. He sank onto the lumpy couch, the springs digging into his back with their familiar, accusatory pressure. He was home. This was his life. The brief, terrifying flash of hope had been nothing but a cruel mirage. He must have dozed off, the emotional exhaustion pulling him into a fitful, dreamless sleep, because the sound of the key in the lock jolted him awake. The room was bathed in the long, orange light of late afternoon. "Daddy!" Lily burst in, a whirlwind of energy and sunshine, her small backpack swinging from her shoulder. Aunt Carol followed, her cheerful expression faltering as she took in his state, the discarded suit, his disheveled hair, the profound defeat etched on his face. "Mikey?" Carol said, her voice soft with concern. Before he could formulate a lie, a deflection, anything to shield his daughter, Lily was upon him, throwing her small arms around his neck. "Did you get the job, Daddy? Did you get the shiny building job?" He held her tight, inhaling the scent of playground and baby shampoo, his heart cracking open. He couldn't lie to her, but he couldn't tell her the whole shameful truth. "Not this time, sweet pea," he murmured into her hair, his voice thick. It wasn't the right fit." Her little body stilled in his arms. She pulled back, her wide, serious eyes searching his face. "But you're the smartest," she said, her voice small and confused. The unwavering faith in that statement was a physical pain. "I know, baby. Sometimes that's not enough." He forced a smile that felt like a crack in glass. "But we're okay. We're always okay, right?" She nodded slowly, not quite convinced, and buried her face in his chest again. Over her head he met Carol's gaze. She gave him a small, sad, knowing smile. "I made a casserole. It's in the fridge. I'll see you tomorrow, Mikey." He just nodded, unable to speak around the lump in his throat. The evening was a quiet, painful pantomime of normalcy. He heated up Carol's casserole, and they ate at the small Formica table. Lily chattered about school, about a ladybug she'd seen, carefully avoiding any further mention of the shiny building. He listened, nodding, his responses automatic. His mind was back in Harrison's office, feeling the walls of his life close in for good. The rent was due in 2 weeks. Lily's shoes were too tight. The goal was gone, and with it, the path forward. After he'd put Lily to bed, reading her a story with a voice he hoped sounded steadier than he felt, he collapsed back onto the couch. The apartment was dark, the only light coming from the flickering blue glow of the small television he kept on for noise. He channel surfed absently, the images a meaningless parade of sitcom laughter and car commercials. Despair was a heavy blanket smothering him. What was he going to do? Then a familiar face filled the screen. It was a news broadcast, but not from a studio. The background was a sterile, pale wall, and the woman sitting in a high-backed chair looked pale and thinner, a rawness around her eyes that makeup couldn't quite conceal. It was Elena Vance. A chyron at the bottom of the screen read, "Exclusive, Elena Vance speaks from hospital." Michael's thumb froze on the remote. He turned up the volume. "And the doctors at St. Vincent's have been absolutely incredible," Elena was saying, her voice softer than her usual broadcast tone, but still carrying its core of intelligence and strength. "It was a severe cardiac event, a warning I was foolish to ignore. But I am on the mend, and more importantly, I am profoundly, eternally grateful." She paused, looking directly into the camera, her gaze intense. "I am told that after I collapsed, dozens of people walked past me. In the heart of one of the busiest cities in the world, I was invisible. But one man stopped. He didn't know who I was. He saw a person in need. He called for help. He stayed with me. He rode in the ambulance with me. He was my guardian angel in a rumpled suit, and then he was gone." Michael's breath caught in his throat. He sat up, leaning forward, the couch springs groaning in protest. "I don't know your name," Elena continued, her voice wavering with a genuine emotion that was utterly captivating. "But I am using this platform, my platform, to find you. I owe you my life. I want to thank you. If you are watching this, please come forward. My team is standing by. This isn't just a personal debt. It's a reminder that in a world that often feels cold and indifferent, a single act of compassion, of seeing someone, truly seeing them, can change everything. It certainly changed mine." The broadcast cut back to the news anchors in the studio, who began discussing the story with reverent tones. Michael sat in the dark, the blue light playing over his stunned face. The world he had just been ejected from was now, through some bizarre twist of fate, publicly praising him. Harrison had called his story a pathetic, contrived, Hallmark movie excuse. And now, the subject of that story was holding it up as a beacon of hope on national television. The irony was so sharp it was painful. He felt a bizarre mix of validation and terror. She was looking for him. The rumpled suit detail would be meaningless to millions, but to him, it was a direct reference. He had a choice. He could stay silent, let the guardian angel remain an anonymous myth, and continue his life of quiet desperation. Or he could step into the light, a light that felt too bright, too exposing. As if on cue, his cheap flip phone vibrated on the coffee table, its tinny rattle startling in the quiet room. The number on the display was a 212 number he didn't recognize. His first gut-wrenching thought was that it was Global Tech's HR calling to formally reject him, or worse, Harrison calling to gloat. He answered cautiously. "Hello? Am I speaking with Michael Thorne?" The voice on the other end was a young man's, polite, efficient, and utterly professional. "Yes, who is this?" "Mr. Thorne, my name is Ben Crawford. I'm Ms. Elena Vance's personal assistant. We've been searching for you." Michael's grip on the phone tightened. He could hear the faint echo of the news broadcast from the television. How did you find me?" "The hospital had your name and number from the note you left with the triage nurse. It took some cross-referencing, but we managed to locate you." Ben's tone was respectful, but there was an undercurrent of excitement. "Mr. Thorne, Ms. Vance saw the news report. She is insistent. She would be honored if you would agree to meet with her." Michael's mind raced. This was it, the call. The one that, in a different life, might have been from Global Tech. Now it was from a world even more alien. "Meet with her?" "Yes, sir. Tomorrow morning, if you're available. At her private office in the Vance Media Building. 10 o'clock? She feels she owes you a debt that can never be fully repaid. But she would like to try, starting with thanking you in person." The formality, the address, the Vance Media Building was a landmark in its own right. It was all overwhelming. What did she want? A thank you? A photo op? To write him a check and be done with it? The part of him that was bruised and humiliated by Harrison wanted to refuse. to hide. But the part that was a father, the part that calculated the cost of new shoes and the fear in his landlord's eyes, knew he had to go. 10 o'clock, Michael heard himself say, his voice a dry croak. Yes, I can be there. Excellent, Ben said, and Michael could hear the smile in his voice. I'll text you the address. And Mr. Thorne, thank you for what you did. The line went dead. Michael sat in the flickering blue dark, the phone still pressed to his ear. He had a new goal. It was terrifyingly vague. Go to Elena Vance's office and see what happened. The obstacle was his own shame, his feeling of being an imposter in these worlds of glass and steel and power. The next morning, he went through the motions. He got Lily ready for school, his anxiety a live wire under his skin. He put on his only other pair of decent trousers and a clean but still frayed button-down shirt. The good suit was a lost cause, a crumpled monument to yesterday's disaster. He kissed Lily goodbye, her simple, I love you, Daddy, a balm and a burden. The journey into Manhattan felt different. He wasn't a hopeful candidate or a frantic sprinter. He was a man walking toward an unknown reckoning. The Vance Media Building was not the sleek, impersonal spire of global tech. It was an older Art Deco building in Midtown, with brass fittings and a sense of established history. He gave his name to the security desk and was immediately waved through with a respectful, "Right this way, Mr. Thorne. Mr. Crawford is expecting you." He was expected. It was a novel feeling. Ben Crawford met him in the lobby. He was a man in his late 20s, impeccably dressed in a slim-cut suit, with an air of capable energy. "Mr. Thorne," he said, shaking Michael's hand with a firm grip. "It's a genuine pleasure. Please, follow me. Elena is eager to see you." They rode a private elevator, paneled in dark wood, to the top floor. The doors opened not into a bustling, open-plan office, but into a serene, spacious anteroom. The air smelled of old books and lemon polish. The walls were lined with framed awards and historic front pages of newspapers. "She's right through there," Ben said, gesturing to a pair of heavy, carved double doors. "Just go on in." Michael nodded, his mouth dry. This was it. He had no script, no rehearsed answers. He was just a man who had stopped when others hadn't. He pushed the doors open. The office was breathtaking. It was a circular room, surrounded by arched windows that offered a stunning 360-degree view of the city. It was part library, part museum, filled with overflowing bookshelves, deep leather armchairs, and artifacts from a lifetime in journalism. It was warm, lived in, and radiated a powerful, formidable intelligence. And there, standing by one of the vast windows, her back to him as she looked out over the skyline, was Elena Vance. She was dressed in a simple, elegant sweater and slacks, looking smaller and more fragile than she did on television, but her presence filled the room. She turned. The morning light caught her face, illuminating the fine lines and the traces of her ordeal. But her eyes, the same intelligent, piercing eyes from the broadcast, were clear and focused directly on him. They held a depth of emotion he hadn't anticipated. Gratitude, yes, but also a sharp, probing curiosity. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the distant, muffled hum of the city far below. Michael stood just inside the doorway, once again feeling shabby and out of place, but held fast by her gaze. She took a step forward, a small, genuine smile touching her lips. "So," she said, her voice soft but clear, cutting through the silence. "You're the man in the rumpled suit." Michael's heart hammered against his ribs. He had entered the room, but he was standing on the precipice of something he couldn't possibly understand. The goal of this meeting was a complete mystery. The only thing he knew for certain was that the woman standing before him held the power to change his life with a word. And he had absolutely no idea what she was going to say next. The silence in the circular office stretched, thin and resonant as a plucked violin string. Michael stood frozen just inside the carved double doors, the city sprawling beneath him like a diorama of a life he couldn't touch. Elena Vance's gaze was a physical weight, scanning him, taking in the frayed cuffs of his shirt, the cheap trousers, the lingering shadow of yesterday's desperation that clung to him like a scent. "So," she said, her voice softer than it was on television, laced with a warmth that seemed to thaw the edges of the vast, silent room. "You're the man in the rumpled suit." Michael's throat was desert dry. He managed a stiff, awkward nod. "Yes, ma'am." That small, genuine smile touched her lips again. She moved away from the window, her steps slow but steady, and gestured to a pair of deep, cognac-colored leather armchairs positioned near a low table stacked with books. "Please, sit. Can I offer you some coffee? Water? Coffee would be great," he said, his voice rough. He moved to the chair, sinking into its buttery softness, feeling it envelop him in a way that was both comforting and alien. This wasn't the grudging sigh of his lumpy couch. This was the embrace of success. Elena poured from a sleek silver carafe on a sideboard, her movements graceful but deliberate, as if she were still conserving energy. She handed him a porcelain cup so delicate he was afraid he might crush it. As he took it, their fingers brushed. Her hand was cool. She sat in the chair opposite him, tucking her legs beneath her, studying him with an unnerving intensity. The morning light streaming through the arched windows illuminated the fine lines around her eyes, the pallor that still lingered beneath her expertly applied makeup. She looked human. Real. "I don't even know where to begin," she started, her voice gaining strength, the familiar cadence of the broadcaster returning, but layered with a raw, personal emotion. "The doctors told me. They said if I'd been there much longer, if no one had stopped." She shook her head, a quick, sharp movement as if to dispel the thought. "They called it a widowmaker, a charming term." She took a sip of her own coffee, her hand perfectly steady. "I remember almost nothing, flashes, the heat of the station floor, the smell of dirt and oil, and then a voice. A man's voice, low, calm, telling me to hang on. That help was coming." She looked directly at him, her eyes glistening. "That was you?" Michael shifted uncomfortably in the luxurious chair. The gratitude felt like a spotlight, exposing all the parts of him he wanted to hide. Anyone would have done the same. "No," she said, the word firm, absolute. "They wouldn't have. That's the point. Dozens of people walked past me. Michael. May I call you Michael?" He nodded mutely. "They saw a problem, or a nuisance, or just another piece of the city's furniture. You saw a person. You stayed. You got in that ambulance. You didn't have to do that." "It was the right thing to do," he said, the simplicity of the statement feeling inadequate in this opulent room. "The right thing is often the rarest thing," she countered. She leaned forward, her expression earnest. "Ben told me he found you through a note you left with a nurse. You gave your number. You asked them to call you. Why? You'd already done more than anyone could ask." Michael looked down into the dark pool of his coffee. He thought of the frantic cab ride back to Global Tech, the guilt he'd felt leaving her. "You were alone," he said quietly. "I didn't like the thought of you being alone." The raw honesty of the statement seemed to strike Elena with visible force. She sat back, a slow breath escaping her. For a moment, the polished anchor was gone, replaced by a woman profoundly, deeply moved. "Thank you," she whispered, the words imbued with a weight that seemed to fill the entire office. "You saved my life. It's not a metaphor, it is a medical fact. I owe you a debt I can never fully repay." The phrase, "a debt I can never fully repay," hung in the air. This was the moment he had been dreading and, in a secret, shameful part of his heart, anticipating. The check, the payoff, the transaction that would settle the account and send him back to Brooklyn with a temporarily patched-up life, but with the fundamental imbalance of power preserved. He braced himself. "There's no debt," he said, forcing himself to meet her gaze. "Knowing you're okay is all the payment I need." She studied him, her head tilted. It was the same probing look she used on politicians she was about to eviscerate on her show. "Is it?" she asked softly. Ben did a little digging. "Standard procedure, I'm afraid, when a stranger is involved. He said you were on your way to a job interview yesterday, at Global Tech." The mention of the name was like a punch to the solar plexus. The sterile room, Janice Davison's dismissive nods, Harrison's contemptuous laughter, it all came rushing back. He felt the heat of shame rise up his neck. He couldn't hide it. "Yes," he admitted, his voice tight. "And you missed it because of me." He shrugged, a feeble, helpless gesture. "The subway was a mess. I was already late. Then Your situation happened. By the time I could even think about the interview, it was long over. A storm began to gather in Elena's eyes. The gratitude was still there, but it was now mixed with a sharp, rising indignation. You lost your chance at a job because you stopped to help me? It wasn't a choice, Michael insisted, the same argument he'd tried to make to Harrison. But this time, it was the unvarnished truth. It was a reflex. A reflex that cost you, she stated, her voice gaining an edge. She stood up, pacing slowly in front of the windows, the skyline at her back. What was the position? Junior data analyst. It was a good opportunity. Stable. He couldn't keep the bleakness out of his voice. I have a daughter. She's 7. Elena stopped pacing. She turned, and the look on her face was one of pure, undiluted fury. It wasn't directed at him, but at the cosmic injustice of it all. A data analyst, she repeated, her tone flat, dangerous. And they wouldn't even hear you out? After you explained what happened? Michael gave a short, bitter laugh, the memory of Harrison's mocking face vivid in his mind. I tried. I called. I spoke to a Mr. Harrison. He didn't believe me. He said it was the most pathetic excuse for professional incompetence he'd ever heard. The air in the room seemed to crackle. Elena's posture went rigid. Joseph Harrison said that to you? You know him? A slow, cold smile spread across Elena's face, one that didn't reach her eyes. Oh, I know him. Global Tech is the single largest sponsor of the Vance Point. They pour millions into my show. Joseph Harrison and I have sat at the same charity galas, exchanged the same hollow pleasantries. She walked back to her chair, but she didn't sit. She leaned on the back of it, her knuckles white. He didn't believe you? That you stopped to save a life? He called it a Hallmark movie excuse, Michael said, the humiliation fresh and acidic. Did he? It wasn't a question. It was a statement, cold and hard as granite. The indignation in her eyes had crystallized into something else entirely, a fierce, predatory focus. The journalist had taken over. The irony is so thick you could cut it with a knife. Their head of strategic communications, a man whose entire job is to control narratives, to spin truth into corporate gold, couldn't recognize a simple, unvarnished truth when it was staring him in the face. She began pacing again, faster now, energy seeming to radiate from her. I've never liked that man. There's a smugness to him, a conviction that the rules are for other people, and I've never been entirely comfortable with Global Tech's cozy relationship with my network. Their sponsorship always felt less like support and more like a leash. A very expensive golden leash. Michael watched her, mesmerized. This was not the conversation he had expected. He had anticipated pity, perhaps a check, a handshake, and a swift exit. He hadn't expected to be a catalyst for what looked like a professional crusade. What are you saying? He asked. I'm saying that a company's character is revealed not in its press releases, but in its actions, she said, stopping and pinning him with her gaze. And firing a man, no, not even firing him, callously discarding him for an act of profound human decency. That tells me everything I need to know about their character. It confirms every private suspicion I've ever had. Her eyes narrowed. Harrison runs a tight ship. He's been there for decades. He's famous for his discretionary hiring power, for placing his nephews and golf partners in lucrative positions. It's an open secret, but no one has ever been able to prove anything. The board adores him because he's a fixer. He makes problems disappear. A new, terrifying hope began to flutter in Michael's chest, so different from the desperate hope he'd felt racing to Global Tech. That had been about survival. This felt dangerous. What are you going to do? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Elena's smile was all sharp edges. What I do best, Michael. I'm going to investigate. If Harrison is this brazen in dismissing you, what other ethical corners is he cutting? What other inconvenient truths has he buried? A company that rewards cynicism and punishes decency? That's a story. A big one. As if on cue, there was a soft knock on the double doors. Ben Crawford entered, holding a slim, plain manila folder. His expression was serious, intent. Elena, he said, his voice low. Sorry to interrupt, but you asked me to pull the preliminary file on the Harrison and Global Tech leads, the ones we've been sitting on. Elena's eyes lit up with a hunter's gleam. Perfect timing, Ben. What have you got? Ben's gaze flickered to Michael, a question in his eyes. "It's fine," Elena said. "Michael is a trusted party in this." Ben nodded and handed her the folder. "It's just a start, but it's suggestive. Very suggestive." Elena took the folder and moved to her desk, a massive antique piece littered with papers, books, and a single, sleek laptop. She opened the folder. Michael watched from his chair, his coffee forgotten, his heart thumping a strange, syncopated rhythm. He was no longer a supplicant. He was a witness. She scanned the first page, her brow furrowed. Then the second. Her lips pressed into a thin, hard line. She turned a third page, and a soft, sharp hiss escaped her. "My God," she murmured. "What is it?" Michael asked, unable to stay silent. She looked up, her face a mask of grim satisfaction and revulsion. "It seems your Mr. Harrison is even more discretionary with company funds than he is with his hiring." She tapped the page. "This is a preliminary analysis of several shell companies that have received multi-million-dollar consulting fees from Global Tech. They're traced back to a network of holding companies, but our financial forensics team has started to peel back the layers." She looked at Ben. "The Cayman account?" Ben nodded. "It's a match. The final beneficiary of all those fees appears to be a trust fund named after Harrison's granddaughter. He's been systematically siphoning money for years, millions." Elena turned another page, her eyes widening slightly. "And this? This is the nepotism list. It's not just a few friends. It's a whole shadow payroll. Dozens of people with no discernible qualifications, in high-salary, no-show jobs. All connected to Harrison. All signed off by him." She looked at Michael, her expression fierce. "He called you unreliable? He called you a pathetic excuse?" He was projecting. "This," she said, holding up the thin folder as if it weighed 1,000 pounds. "This is pathetic. This is the real incompetence. The corruption of an entire corporate division for personal greed." Michael felt the world tilt. The immaculate, powerful image of Global Tech, the fortress that had so decisively rejected him, was showing deep, festering cracks. The man who had looked at him with such utter contempt was not just a bully. He was a criminal. Elena closed the folder with a definitive snap. The sound echoed in the silent office. She looked from the dossier to Michael, her journalist's mind clearly connecting dots at lightning speed. "This changes everything," she said, her voice low and charged with intensity. "This isn't just a story about corporate ethics anymore. This is fraud, embezzlement, on a massive scale." She paused, her gaze locking with his. "You came here for a thank you, Michael. But you've given me something infinitely more valuable. You've given me the key. You've given me the reason why a man like Joseph Harrison would be so threatened by a man like you. You represent everything his world is built to crush. Honesty, self-sacrifice, simple human goodness. You are the living, breathing proof of his moral bankruptcy." She came around the desk, the folder held tightly in her hand. The morning sun glinted off its manila surface. "I'm not just going to thank you, Michael. I'm going to finish what you started. I'm going to take this," she said, raising the dossier, "and I'm going to bring that entire rotten edifice crashing down around Harrison's ears." The ferocity of her promise was breathtaking. It was more than he had ever dared to hope for. It was vengeance, it was justice, it was a cataclysm. But as the initial shockwave passed, a cold, practical fear seeped into Michael's veins. He was no longer just a witness. He was now intrinsically linked to this. Harrison would know. Harrison would come for him. Elena seemed to read his mind. Her expression softened, but the determination in her eyes remained undimmed. "This puts you in the crosshairs, Michael. I can't pretend it doesn't, but you won't be alone. You have my protection, my resources. And when this is over, I will make sure you have a job that doesn't just pay the bills, but that honors the man you are." It was everything he needed to hear. A lifeline, a purpose, and a promise of stability. But the cost was stepping into a war he hadn't chosen. Before he could respond, Ben, who had been watching the exchange with a focused stillness, spoke up. His phone was in his hand, the screen lit up. "Elena," he said, his voice urgent, losing its usual professional calm. "We have a problem." Elena turned. "What is it?" "That was our security detail downstairs. There are 2 men in the lobby. They flashed badges, corporate security badges, from Global Tech. A cold dread, familiar and sharp, pierced Michael's heart. They had found him. Already. Ben's face was grim. "They're demanding to speak with Mr. Thorne. They say he took confidential company documents from Mr. Harrison's office yesterday. They're claiming he's a corporate spy." The air in Elena Vance's opulent circular office, which had moments before crackled with the electric promise of a crusade, suddenly went cold and still. The word spies hung in the space between them, a toxic cloud. Michael felt the blood drain from his face. His heart, which had been thumping with a strange mix of vindication and fear, now seemed to freeze solid in his chest. They're here, already. He looked from Elena's grimly set face to Ben's urgent expression. The manila folder on Elena's desk, once a symbol of potential justice, now felt like a bomb in the room with them. Corporate security? Accusing him of theft? Elena's voice was a low, dangerous whisper. Her eyes, sharp with a journalist's instinct for a cover-up, narrowed. That's not a security matter. That's a legal matter. They're bluffing. They're trying to intimidate him before he can talk. "They're in the lobby, being polite but firm with our security," Ben reported, his phone still pressed to his ear. "They say they just want to ask Mr. Thorne a few questions about his unauthorized removal of documents. They claim he stole proprietary data during his interview yesterday. The interview I never actually had," Michael muttered, a cold fury beginning to mix with his panic. Harrison was not just corrupt. He was ruthless. He was moving to discredit and silence him before Elena could even act. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. Elena strode to her desk and pressed a button on her intercom. "Marjorie, get Robert from legal on the line, now. And alert building security that under no circumstances are 2 men from Global Tech Corporate Security to be allowed past the lobby. They are to be escorted out of the building immediately if they attempt to approach any of my staff or guests." She released the button and turned to Michael. Her expression was no longer one of grateful survivor or crusading journalist. It was that of a general preparing for battle. They've overplayed their hand. Accusing you of theft? That's a desperate move. It means Harrison is scared. He knows his story about you doesn't hold up to scrutiny, so he's trying to create a bigger, uglier story to bury it. "What do we do?" Michael asked, his voice tight. The "we" felt foreign, but necessary. "We do what they least expect," Elena said, a slow, determined smile spreading across her face. It was a smile that had made senators sweat. "We go public. Not with the full story yet. We need more evidence for that. But with the first salvo. We break the leash." She turned to Ben. "Get me a secure line to Martin Croft. Right now." Ben's eyes widened. "The network president? Elena, are you sure? The sponsorship is about to become a millstone around this network's neck," she finished for him. "I won't have my integrity and this man's safety held hostage by a contract. Now, Ben." As Ben hurried to make the call, Elena picked up the manila folder. "Michael, what you did in that subway was an act of courage. What's about to happen will require a different kind. Are you ready?" He thought of Lily, of the lumpy couch, of Harrison's mocking laughter. He thought of the cold, dirty floor of the subway station and the faint, thready pulse beneath his fingers. He had already lost one future. He was staring into the abyss of another, more terrifying one. But for the first time, he wasn't facing it alone. "Yes," he said, and the word felt like a vow. Abyss. An hour later, Michael sat on a sleek, modern sofa in a different part of the Vance Media Building, a private screening room with soundproofed walls and a large monitor currently displaying a live feed. On the screen, Elena Vance sat at the iconic minimalist desk of the Vance Point studio. But this wasn't her evening broadcast. This was a special, unscheduled announcement, streamed live across the network's digital platforms and fed to every major news outlet. The chyron at the bottom of the screen was stark and simple. A personal announcement from Elena Vance. Ben stood beside Michael, arms crossed, watching the monitor with a focused intensity. "She's going nuclear," he murmured, a note of awe in his voice. In the studio, Elena looked directly into the camera, her demeanor calm but resolute, the familiar weight of her authority settling over the lens. "Good morning," she began, her voice clear and steady. "I am speaking to you today not just as a journalist, but as a citizen, and as a woman who was given a second chance at life this week. As many of you know, I suffered a serious medical emergency in a New York City subway station. My life was saved by the quick, selfless actions of a stranger, a man who saw a human being in distress and chose to stop when dozens of others did not. Michael's throat tightened. He watched himself become a story, a parable. That act of profound decency, Elena continued, her gaze intensifying, had a ripple effect. It set in motion a chain of events that has led me to a difficult but necessary decision. The company that employs my rescuer, a man who sacrificed his own professional opportunity to ensure my safety, is Global Tech. A soft, almost imperceptible murmur ran through the invisible studio audience. Global Tech is and has been for many years the primary sponsor of this broadcast. They are a titan of industry, a name synonymous with American innovation. But in recent days, I have been confronted with compelling evidence of a profound ethical sickness at the heart of its leadership, specifically within its upper management and strategic communications division. She paused, letting the weight of the accusation settle. When my rescuer, a man simply trying to provide for his young daughter, was late for his interview due to his life-saving actions, he was not met with understanding or compassion. He was met with contempt. He was mocked. He was called a liar, and ultimately he was discarded. The message from this corporate giant was chillingly clear. Human decency is an unacceptable excuse for a deviation from corporate protocol. Michael watched, his hands clenched into fists on his knees. She was laying it all out, turning his humiliation into a weapon. This incident was not an anomaly, Elena's voice sharpened, becoming the scalpel she was famous for. It was a symptom. It prompted a preliminary review of business practices that has revealed a pattern of behavior that is, in my professional opinion, irreconcilable with the values of this news organization and with my personal integrity. Therefore, effective immediately, I am severing all ties between the Vance Point and Global Tech. We are terminating our sponsorship contract. The silence in the screening room was absolute. On the screen, Elena held her pose, her statement hanging in the air like the ringing of a bell. It was a declaration of war, broadcast to the entire world. She did it, Ben whispered, a grin spreading across his face. She actually did it. The feed cut back to the network's news anchors, who looked stunned, scrambling to fill airtime with commentary. Ben's phone began to vibrate incessantly, a torrent of calls and messages flooding in. Michael sat back, a wave of dizziness washing over him. It was done. The first domino had fallen. The goal had been to strike back, to expose Harrison's initial cruelty, and she had done it in the most public way imaginable. The obstacle of Global Tech's immense power had been met with the formidable power of Elena Vance's platform. But the battle, he knew, was just beginning. The response from Global Tech was not long in coming. It arrived not as a phone call, but as a terse, legalistic press release, followed by a hastily arranged press conference. Michael and Elena watched it together in her office later that afternoon on a large wall-mounted screen. The man at the podium was not Joseph Harrison, but the company's CEO, a man named Richard Stratton with a patrician demeanor and a head of perfectly coiffed silver hair. He looked calm, statesmanlike, and utterly unruffled. Global Tech has always held itself to the highest ethical standards, Stratton began, his voice a smooth, reassuring baritone. We are deeply disappointed by Ms. Vance's unilateral and, we believe, rash decision to end our long and productive partnership. Her allegations are vague, unsubstantiated, and appear to be based on a single, unfortunate misunderstanding regarding a candidate who was, by all accounts, late for a scheduled interview and unable to provide a verifiable account for his tardiness. On the couch, Michael flinched. The misunderstanding, the unverifiable account. They were sticking to Harrison's story, polishing it for public consumption. While we admire Ms. Vance's work and are grateful for the role a bystander played in her medical emergency, Stratton continued, a condescending smile touching his lips, we cannot allow the personal sentiments of one individual, no matter how well-intentioned, to damage the reputation of this company and its 60,000 dedicated employees. We have attempted to reach out to Ms. Vance privately to resolve this matter, but she has refused to engage. Therefore, we have been left with no choice but to pursue all available legal remedies for breach of contract and defamation. The threat was explicit. They were going to sue her. Elena muted the broadcast. The silence in her office was thick with tension. "They're circling the wagons," she said, her voice cold. "They're betting their arrogance and their legal team can outmuscle the truth. They think this is a PR problem to be managed, not a cancer to be cut out." "What now?" Michael asked, the CEO's calm dismissal making him feel small and insignificant all over again. "Now," Elena said, her eyes glinting with a hard light, "we show them the cancer." The following days were a whirlwind of clandestine activity. Elena, operating from her convalescence at home, became the command center of a shadow war. Her team of investigative journalists, unleashed with her personal guarantee of protection, worked around the clock. Ben was a constant presence, a conduit of information, his phone a permanent appendage to his hand. Michael was given a temporary office, a small, windowless but secure room, and a new encrypted laptop. His role was that of a consultant, a living witness to the character of the man they were trying to bring down. He spent hours with the financial forensics team, explaining his brief, disastrous encounter with Harrison, providing context that helped them interpret the cold numbers on their screens. The evidence mounted with terrifying speed. The shell companies, the Cayman accounts, the shadow payroll, the paper trail was a masterpiece of concealed corruption. But Elena's team, armed with a specific target and a righteous fury, began to tear it apart. A week after her initial announcement, Elena requested a private, off-the-record meeting with the Global Tech Board of Directors. It was a bold, high-stakes gambit. She would present them with the evidence and give them one chance to clean their own house before she took it all public. The meeting was held in a neutral location, a private conference room at a prestigious law firm in Midtown. Michael waited with Ben in Elena's town car, parked discreetly around the corner. The air inside the vehicle was thick with anticipation. "This is it," Ben said, staring at the building's entrance. "If they have any sense, they'll take the deal. Fire Harrison, publicly apologize, institute massive reforms. And if they don't?" Michael asked, though he already knew the answer. Ben just shook his head. "Then it all burns." An hour later, the rear door of the car opened and Elena slid in. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with a cold, pure fire. She didn't say a word, just gave a sharp, single nod to her driver. "Back to the office, now." As the car pulled into traffic, she finally spoke, her voice low and vibrating with controlled rage. "Arrogant, smug, incorrigible." "They refused?" Ben asked, his shoulders slumping slightly. "Worse," Elena spat. They laughed. Stratton, Harrison, he was there, smirking in the corner like a gargoyle. They called it amateur hour. They said our evidence was circumstantial fantasy. They accused us of industrial espionage. They threatened not just to sue the network into oblivion, but to file criminal charges against me personally. She turned to look at Michael, her expression grim. They told me to stick to reading the teleprompter and leave the real business to them. Michael felt a sickening lurch in his stomach. They hadn't just rejected the evidence. They had spat on the messenger. The obstacle was no longer just one corrupt executive. It was the entrenched, unshakable arrogance of an entire corporate culture. Elena's phone buzzed. She looked at the screen, and a slow, terrifying smile spread across her face. It was the smile of someone who has just run out of alternatives and is embracing the only one left. "Ben," she said, her voice now eerily calm. "Call the control room. Tell them to clear the schedule for the evening broadcast. We're going live with everything." That night, the Vance Point did not begin with its usual musical cue or sweeping graphics. It opened on a tight shot of Elena Vance at her desk, a single folder in front of her. The set was darker than usual, the lighting dramatic, serious. "Good evening," she began, her voice devoid of its usual warmth. "1 week ago, I announced I was ending this program's relationship with its longtime sponsor, Global Tech. I cited ethical concerns. Tonight, I am going to show you why." For the next 20 minutes, television history was made. With methodical, devastating precision, Elena laid out the case. She didn't just report the story. She performed an autopsy on a corporate soul. Graphics flashed on the screen behind her, diagrams of the shell companies, copies of wire transfers with amounts that made viewers gasp, lists of the no-show jobs with salaries that dwarfed Michael's yearly rent. She named names. She quoted figures. She connected the dots from the Cayman Islands Trust Fund back to Joseph Harrison's desk. And then she brought it back to the human cost. "And how does a man like this maintain his power?" she asked, leaning into the camera. "He does it by creating a culture of fear and cynicism. He does it by ruthlessly eliminating anyone who represents a threat to his corrupt empire, even if that threat comes in the form of a single desperate father, late for a job interview because he stopped to save a life." She didn't name Michael, protecting him for the moment, but she told his story. She recounted the subway collapse, the ambulance, and the subsequent meeting with Harrison, quoting his mocking, contemptuous words verbatim. She framed it not as a personal grievance, but as the quintessential example of the moral rot she had just exposed with documents and data. The broadcast was a thunderclap. In living rooms, in bars, in the offices of rival corporations, people watched, stunned. It was more than a scandal. It was a masterpiece of investigative journalism, a takedown of breathtaking scope and courage. In his small, temporary office, Michael watched the broadcast on his laptop, his heart pounding. He saw his private humiliation transformed into a public indictment. He saw the fortress of global tech, which had seemed so impregnable, being pummeled by artillery shells of truth. The moment the broadcast ended, his phone rang. It was Ben. "It started," Ben said, his voice breathless with excitement. "The financial networks are going crazy. It's all they're talking about." Michael quickly pulled up a financial news website. The screen was a blaze of red. Headlines screamed about the allegations, and in the center of the screen, a real-time ticker showed the performance of Global Tech's stock. His breath caught in his throat. The ticker was a waterfall of negative numbers. The stock price was in free fall, plummeting with a speed that seemed almost physically impossible. The number next to it, indicating the drop, was already in double digits and diving further by the second. It was a rout, a panic. He could hear the frantic, raised voices of the financial commentators in the background of Ben's call, their professional calm shattered. Words like unprecedented, corporate governance failure, and total meltdown cut through the static. Michael sat back in his chair, the sounds of the financial apocalypse buzzing faintly from his phone. The goal had been to expose the truth, to hold Harrison accountable. The obstacle had been the company's immense power and arrogance. They had shattered that obstacle, but in doing so, they had unleashed something far larger and more uncontrollable than he had ever imagined. He stared at the cascading numbers on the screen, a cold dread seeping into his bones alongside the grim satisfaction. This wasn't just a scandal anymore. This was a conflagration. The cliffhanger was no longer a question of whether they would win, but of what would be left standing in the ashes. The financial news anchor's voice, tinny and strained from his laptop speaker, posed the question that was on everyone's mind. The question that would haunt Michael through the night. The question now is not if heads will roll at Global Tech, but whether the entire company can survive the night. The silence in the small, windowless office was broken only by the frantic, tinny voices spewing from the laptop speaker. Michael stared, mesmerized and horrified, at the financial news channel's ticker. The numbers for Global Tech's stock weren't just falling. They were in a death spiral, a vertiginous plunge of red digits that seemed to suck the very air out of the room. The anchor's voice, usually a model of detached analysis, was pitched high with disbelief. "A catastrophic devaluation, Jim, unlike anything I've seen in 20 years covering this sector. The allegations laid out by Elena Vance have acted like a financial neutron bomb, wiping out billions in market capitalization in a matter of minutes. The question now is not if heads will roll at Global Tech, but whether the entire company can survive the night." The phone in Michael's hand felt slick with sweat. Ben was still on the line, his own voice a distant, excited buzz that Michael could no longer process. He ended the call, the click of the flip phone a small, insignificant sound against the backdrop of the digital apocalypse on his screen. He had wanted justice. He had wanted Harrison to be held accountable for his cruelty, for his corruption. He had not wanted this. This was a tsunami, and he felt like the man who had unknowingly kicked the first pebble that started the avalanche. The sheer scale of the destruction was terrifying. 60,000 employees, their pensions, their livelihoods, all now swirling in the vortex of a scandal he had helped unleash. The obstacle of global tech's power hadn't just been overcome. It had been atomized, but the victory felt ashen, the satisfaction poisoned by the magnitude of the collateral damage. The door to his temporary office opened, and Elena Vance stood there, backlit by the hallway light. She had just come from the studio, still wearing the sharp, dark suit from her broadcast, her face a mask of focused intensity. She looked at the laptop screen, at the cascading numbers, and a flicker of something, not regret, but a grim acknowledgement, passed through her eyes. "It's begun," she said, her voice husky from the on-air exertion. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her, sealing them in the small, soundproofed room. The board will be in emergency session within the hour. Stratton's already released a statement calling for an internal investigation. An investigation? Michael's voice was rough. Into what? They saw your evidence. They laughed at it. They're not laughing now, Elena replied, a sharp edge to her words. They're scrambling for lifeboats. And in situations like this, the first thing you do is throw the dead weight overboard to keep the ship from sinking. She leaned against the door, crossing her arms. Harrison will be their sacrifice. He's finished? But that's not enough. A public execution isn't a cure. It's a symptom of a deeper disease. The culture that allowed him to thrive still exists. Michael looked away from the screen, the relentless red glow giving him a headache. What does that mean? It means the fight isn't over. It's just changing battlegrounds. She pushed off the door and began to pace the small confines of the room, a caged tiger brimming with purpose. Global Tech was a gilded cage. Their sponsorship was a leash. Now that it's broken, I have a responsibility and an opportunity to do more than just report the news. I can help shape a better alternative. She stopped and fixed him with that penetrating gaze. You asked me what was next, Michael. This is what's next. Action. Not just exposure, but construction. Before he could ask what she meant, her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, and that slow, terrifying smile returned. Speak of the devil. And right on time, she answered, putting it on speaker. Ben, tell me you have good news. The best, Ben's voice crackled, buzzing with a new, different kind of energy. I just got off the line with David Chen's office. He saw the broadcast. He's impressed. And he's moving fast. He wants to talk. Tonight. David Chen? Michael asked, the name ringing a faint bell. CEO of Ethereum, Elena clarified, her eyes alight. Global Tech's biggest competitor, and they're polar opposite in every way that matters. Founded on a charter of radical transparency and ethical sourcing. They've been the conscience of the tech industry for a decade, but they've never had a marketing budget to compete with the giants. She spoke back into the phone. Set it up, Ben, my home. 1 hour, and tell him. Tell him to bring his checkbook and his best offer. An hour later, Michael found himself sitting in the stunning minimalist living room of Elena's Upper East Side brownstone. It was a world away from his cramped studio, all clean lines, muted tones, and priceless modern art. The air smelled of beeswax and old money. He felt like a fossil that had been unearthed and placed in a museum display. Elena, having changed into a simple cashmere sweater and slacks, moved with a calm assurance that belied the seismic shifts happening in the corporate world outside her windows. She poured glasses of water from a crystal pitcher, her hands steady. The doorbell chimed, a soft melodic tone. A moment later, Ben ushered in a man who could not have been more different from Joseph Harrison. David Chen was young, perhaps in his early 40s, with an athletic build and an open, intelligent face. He wore a comfortable-looking blazer over a dark t-shirt and jeans. He moved with an easy confidence that didn't need to assert itself. Elena, he said, his voice warm and firm as he shook her hand. A breathtaking piece of journalism, truly. You've done the entire industry a service. David, thank you for coming on such short notice, Elena replied, gesturing to the seating area. This is Michael Thorne. David turned to Michael, and his gaze was not one of assessment or pity, but of genuine respect. He didn't offer a handshake, but a slight, respectful bow of his head. Mr. Thorne, it's an honor. The world needs more people who are willing to do the right thing, regardless of the cost. The simple, direct acknowledgement, so devoid of agenda or condescension, left Michael momentarily speechless. He managed a nod. "Thank you, sir." They sat. There was no small talk. "I assume you didn't invite me here just to admire your art collection, Elena," David began, a faint smile on his lips. "No," she said, leaning forward. "I'm ending my show's relationship with its network. I'm taking the Vance Point independent. I'm building my own media platform, one entirely funded by and dedicated to partners who share a commitment to integrity. I want Ethereum to be its founding sponsor." David Chen steepled his fingers, his expression turning serious. "That's a bold move. A very expensive one. Global Tech was paying you, what, $30 million a year?" "40, Elena corrected smoothly. "And I'm not asking you to match that. I'm asking you to surpass it. A 5-year, $300 million commitment. In return, you get exclusive category sponsorship and a seat at the table in shaping a new kind of business journalism." Michael felt the air leave his lungs. The numbers were astronomical, figures from a different universe than the one where he calculated the cost of a school trip. David Chen didn't flinch. He simply watched Elena, his dark eyes thoughtful. "That's a significant investment. What's the ROI? Beyond the good PR of associating with the woman who just slew Goliath?" "The return," Elena said, her voice dropping, becoming more intense, "is the creation of a powerful, unassailable megaphone for the values Ethereum claims to champion. It's proof that ethics and profitability are not mutually exclusive. It's a direct challenge to the global tech model, demonstrating that consumers and investors will reward the good guys. But—" She paused, letting the word hang in the elegantly appointed room. "There's a condition." "I assumed there would be," David said, a glint of amusement in his eyes. Elena gestured to Michael. "My second demand is that you create a new executive position at Ethereum, head of ethical integrity, a role that reports directly to the board. Someone with the authority to audit any project, any contract, any hire, a watchdog with teeth. And I want Michael Thorne to be the first person to hold that title." The world tilted. Michael's heart slammed against his ribs. He stared at Elena, then at David Chen. This wasn't a job offer. It was a consecration. It was an impossibility. David Chen turned his calm, appraising gaze to Michael. "The head of ethical integrity," he repeated, as if tasting the title. "It's a role I've wanted to create for years, but I could never find the right person. It can't be a career bureaucrat or a lawyer. It has to be someone who has lived it, someone who has proven with their own life that their principles are not negotiable." He was silent for a long moment, the only sound the soft hum of the central air conditioning. "Your story, Mr. Thorne, is your resume. Your actions in that subway station are your cover letter. The way you stood up to Harrison, according to Elena's account, is your letter of recommendation." He nodded slowly, a decision solidifying in his mind. "Yes, it's perfect." "Wait," Michael finally managed, his voice a dry croak. I'm a data analyst. Or I was. I have no experience leading anything. I don't know the first thing about corporate governance." "I have plenty of people who understand corporate governance," David interjected gently. "What I don't have is someone who understands the cost of integrity at a gut level. This job isn't about knowing the rules, Michael. It's about having the courage to enforce them, even when it's inconvenient, even when it costs you. You've already passed the only test that matters." He looked back at Elena. "You have a deal, Elena, the $300 million, and the position for Mr. Thorne. My lawyers will have the contracts to you by morning." The meeting, the deal, that would reshape the media and tech landscape was sealed in less than 15 minutes. As David Chen stood to leave, he shook Michael's hand, his grip firm and sure. "Welcome to Ethereum, Michael. We're building something better, and we need people like you to help us build it right." The news broke like a second wave the next day. While global tech continued to hemorrhage value and announce the resignation of Joseph Harrison, the media was electrified by the twin announcements: Elena Vance's bold independent move and Ethereum's landmark sponsorship, which was widely seen as a corporate endorsement of her crusade. Michael's life became a surreal blur. He was given a corporate attorney to negotiate a salary that made his head spin. He was fitted for suits that didn't fray at the cuffs, the soft, rich wool feeling alien against his skin. He spent a day with a gentle, efficient woman from HR who walked him through his breathtaking benefits package, including a college fund for Lily. It was a future, solid and secure, handed to him on a silver platter. A week later, he stood outside the Ethereum headquarters in downtown Manhattan. It was not a cold, imposing tower, but a renovated, light-filled industrial building with a living wall of greenery in the lobby and a warm, buzzing energy. People smiled as they passed. There were no hushed, reverent tones. Ben, who had been hired as Elena's chief of staff for her new venture, met him at the entrance. "Ready for your first day, Mr. Thorne?" "Don't call me that," Michael said, though he smiled. The title still felt like a costume. "You'll get used to it," Ben laughed, clapping him on the shoulder. "Come on, David wants to introduce you himself." They took the open, panoramic elevator to the top floor. It was nothing like Harrison's opulent lair. The space was open and airy, with collaborative work tables, glass-walled meeting rooms, and a sprawling rooftop garden. David Chen was waiting for them, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Michael, good to see you." He handed him a cup. "I thought I'd give you a quick tour before we get you settled in your office." As they walked, David explained the company's philosophy, pointing out the recycling systems, the communal spaces, the open-book management style. It was a world built on trust, the antithesis of everything global tech had represented. Michael's goal, which had once been so terrifyingly simple, get the job, had now evolved into something equally daunting: be worthy of this one. They turned a corner into a more secluded but still light-filled corridor of executive offices. And then, Michael saw it. Across the hall, through the open door of a large corner office, a team of movers was carefully wrapping a massive, pretentious abstract painting in bubble wrap. A man in a rumpled, expensive suit, his back to them, was emptying the drawers of a vast desk into a single, small cardboard box. His movements were stiff, jerky with a suppressed fury and humiliation. It was Joseph Harrison. As if sensing their presence, Harrison turned. His face, usually a mask of smug authority, was pale and haggard, the lines around his mouth deeply etched. His cold blue eyes, once full of contemptuous power, were now hollowed out with defeat. They locked with Michael's. For a long, excruciating moment, neither man moved or spoke. The air crackled with the unspoken history between them, the mocking, laughter, the accusations, the ruined suit, the desperate run through Midtown. Harrison's gaze swept over Michael, taking in the new, impeccably tailored suit, the calm confidence that came from being welcomed, not scorned. He saw David Chen standing slightly behind him, a protective, approving presence. The realization of the total inversion of their fortunes was a physical blow to Harrison. His jaw tightened, a muscle twitching violently in his cheek. The humiliation was absolute. He was the one being cleaned out, discarded, his career in ruins. And the man he had dismissed as unreliable and not global tech material was standing there, about to assume a position of power in the company that was now the darling of the ethical world. Harrison's eyes dropped first. He turned back to his desk, picked up a heavy crystal paperweight, and shoved it into the box with a loud, careless clunk. He didn't look up again. The conversation was over. He had been judged and found wanting. David Chen placed a hand on Michael's back, a subtle, guiding pressure. "This way, Michael," he said softly, his voice devoid of gloating, merely stating a fact. "Your office is just down here." Michael took one last look at the broken man packing his failures into a cardboard box. There was no triumph in it, only a profound, sobering sense of closure. The obstacle had not just been overcome, it had been erased. David stopped at a door with a freshly mounted nameplate. Michael Thorne, Head of Ethical Integrity. He pushed the door open. "It's all yours. Get settled. My assistant will bring by the first round of audits for your review after lunch." Michael stepped over the threshold. The office was spacious and bright, with a floor-to-ceiling window offering a stunning view of the Brooklyn Bridge. It was sparsely furnished. A modern desk of reclaimed wood, a comfortable-looking chair, a small sitting area, and empty bookshelves waiting to be filled. It was a blank canvas. On the desk, centered with care, was a single, simple silver frame. Inside was a photograph of Lily, taken at Coney Island the previous summer. She was laughing, her head thrown back, her gap-toothed smile radiant and full of unshakable joy. It was the why. It had always been the why. He walked to the desk, his footsteps silent on the plush carpet. He ran a finger over the smooth, cool glass of the picture frame. The gnawing fear in his gut was gone. The arithmetic of survival had been solved. The lumpy couch, the damp apartment, the accusatory springs, they were part of a past life. He had a new goal now, more complex and meaningful than any he had ever held. To be worthy of this trust, to protect the integrity of this place, to ensure that the world Lily grew up in had a few more companies like Ethereum in it. He sat in the chair, the leather sighing softly, not in relief but in welcome. He looked from the picture of his daughter, the source of all his strength, to the empty bookshelves, symbols of a future he was now empowered to build. He had entered the room. He had survived the storm. He had a title, a salary, a purpose. But as the silence of the new office settled around him, a deep, resonant silence so different from the anxious quiet of his apartment, a new and unsettling question began to form in his mind, a quiet whisper beneath the surface of his hard-won peace. He had the job. He had the security. He had the title. But did he, Michael Thorne, the man from the rumpled suit, truly have the first clue how to be the man this new nameplate demanded he be? The silence in the new office was a living thing, thick and expectant, absorbing the faint hum of the city beyond the window. Michael Thorne sat in the chair, his hands resting on the cool, reclaimed wood of the desk. The nameplate, Michael Thorne, Head of Ethical Integrity, seemed to pulse with a light of its own, a beacon of a reality he still couldn't fully grasp. He looked from the radiant, gap-toothed smile of his daughter in the silver frame to the stark, empty bookshelves. The question echoed in the quiet space, a ghost from his old life haunting the threshold of his new one. Did he have the first clue how to be the man this new nameplate demanded? The first few weeks were a baptism by fire, a relentless current of meetings, reports, and a steep, often terrifying, learning curve. The Ethereum employees, while welcoming, watched him with a cautious intellectual curiosity. He was the living parable, the subway Samaritan. He knew they were wondering if he was a symbol or a substance. His goal was simple and immense, to prove he was the latter. His first test came not as a dramatic confrontation, but as a dense 50-page procurement audit for a new server farm in Nebraska. The numbers were clean, the sourcing was ethical, but a single buried clause on page 47 gave him pause. It was a liability waiver that seemed to unfairly penalize a small, family-owned recycling company handling the hardware disposal. It was the kind of clause Joseph Harrison would have dismissed as standard boilerplate, the cost of doing business. Michael's instinct, the same one that had made him kneel on a dirty subway floor, twitched. He spent a night he should have spent sleeping cross-referencing similar contracts, Ethereum's corporate charter, and state environmental regulations. The next morning, he walked into David Chen's office, his heart thumping, the annotated contract in his hand. "David, I have a concern about the Nebraska project," he began, his voice tighter than he wanted. David looked up from his screen, his expression open. "Go ahead, Michael." He laid it out, pointing to the clause, explaining how it shifted an undue burden onto a minor partner, a practice that contradicted Ethereum's public commitment to equitable partnerships. He finished, bracing for dismissal, for a lesson in pragmatism. David listened, nodded, and then picked up his phone. "Sarah, get the legal team and the head of procurement in here. And get me the CEO of Heartland Recycling on the line." He looked back at Michael, a genuine smile on his face. "This is exactly why you're here, Michael." "We didn't see it. Thank you." The clause was renegotiated. The small company was given more favorable terms. It was a minor victory in the grand scheme of a multi-billion-dollar corporation, but for Michael, it was everything. It was proof that his compass, calibrated in a world of struggle, worked in this world of plenty. The obstacle of his own imposter syndrome began, slowly, to crack. 6 months later, the transformation was no longer just external. The man who now walked the sun-drenched, plant-filled halls of Ethereum carried himself with a quiet, earned assurance. The suits no longer felt like costumes. They felt like a uniform for a war he believed in. He had found his rhythm, his voice. He wasn't just the subway Samaritan anymore. He was Michael from Ethical Integrity, the one you went to with a tricky problem before it became a scandal. The most profound change, however, was waiting for him at home. The "For Rent" sign was gone from the old Brooklyn walk-up, a memory fading like a bad dream. Now, he stood in the bright, airy kitchen of a modest but beautiful 2-bedroom apartment in a good Queens neighborhood, its windows looking out onto a street with trees, not a brick wall. The scent of damp was replaced by the smell of lemon polish and the peanut butter and jelly sandwich he was making. "Lily, come on, sweet pea, we can't be late." Lily emerged from her room, a whirlwind of energy in her new school uniform, a plaid jumper and a crisp white blouse. Her old too-tight shoes were gone, replaced by sturdy, comfortable black ones. She spun, making the skirt flare out. "Do I look smart, Daddy?" "You look like the smartest kid in all of New York," he said, his heart swelling with a love so fierce it was almost painful. The private school, St. Bridget's Academy, had offered her a full scholarship after a discreet, anonymous recommendation from a certain influential news anchor. It wasn't a handout. It was an investment, they'd said, in a child with such a remarkable father. Lily was thriving, her world expanding from the 4 walls of a studio apartment to include science fairs, art classes, and playdates in parks that didn't have broken glass on the ground. The gnawing fear in his gut was gone. The arithmetic of survival had been solved. He packed her lunch, a sandwich, an apple, a yogurt, and a small homemade cookie, into a new lunchbox. There was no more counting the days until the savings ran out. There was only the calm, steady rhythm of a secure life. His phone buzzed on the counter. It was a news alert. He tapped it open, and a headline filled the screen. "Global Tech announces comprehensive ethical overhaul. Appoints new independent oversight committee." He read the article as he helped Lily with her backpack. The stock had stabilized, but at a much lower valuation. Under intense pressure from shareholders and the specter of federal investigation, the old board had been purged. Richard Stratton was out. Joseph Harrison had vanished from public life, his name now a byword for corporate corruption in business school case studies. The new CEO was a woman from their sustainability division, and her first act had been to publicly adopt a version of Ethereum's ethical charter, creating a new, powerful internal audit role modeled explicitly on the one Michael held. The company that had spat him out was now, in a desperate bid for survival, trying to become more like him. The obstacle hadn't just been defeated, it had been converted. "What is it, Daddy?" Lily asked, noticing his distant look. He smiled down at her, tucking a strand of dark hair behind her ear. "Just the world getting a little bit better, sweet pea. Ready to go?" That evening, after he'd picked Lily up from an after-school coding club, a phrase that still felt miraculous to him, they took a car service to the Upper East Side. Lily pressed her face against the window, watching the glittering city stream by. "Is her house really a castle, Daddy?" "Not a castle exactly, but it's very nice." Elena Vance's brownstone was, as always, a bastion of quiet elegance. But when the housekeeper ushered them in, the atmosphere was different, warmer. The sterile perfection had been softened by the presence of a life being fully lived again. A plush throw blanket was draped over one of the sofas, and a stack of children's books sat on the coffee table, left there from a previous visit. Elena herself was in the living room, standing by the grand piano. She looked healthier than Michael had ever seen her, the gauntness replaced by a soft strength, the professional sharpness in her eyes tempered by a deep, personal contentment. She was wearing jeans and a simple black sweater, and she held a small velvet box in her hands. "Michael, Lily, I'm so glad you're here," she said, her voice warm. She knelt down, bringing herself to Lily's eye level. "And look at you. A proper scholar," Lily beamed, suddenly shy. "I'm learning to code." "Are you? That's wonderful." Elena held out the velvet box. "I saw this and thought of you. A small token to celebrate your new school." Lily looked at Michael, who nodded. She carefully took the box and opened it. Inside, on a bed of white silk, lay a simple, beautiful silver chain with a small, polished ammonite fossil pendant. "It's for wisdom," Elena explained softly. "And for resilience. It's a creature that lived a long, long time ago, and it turned all the pressure and the weight of the world into this beautiful, strong spiral. Just like you and your daddy." Michael's throat tightened. He watched as Elena fastened the clasp around Lily's neck. The fossil rested perfectly against the plaid of her jumper, a tiny, ancient treasure. "Thank you, Miss Vance," Lily whispered, her eyes wide with awe. "Please, call me Elena." She stood up, her gaze meeting Michael's over Lily's head. There was a profound understanding in that look. They had been through a fire together and had both emerged, not just intact, but remade. They moved to the sitting area. The housekeeper brought in a tray with hot chocolate for Lily and tea for the adults. "I saw the news about global tech," Michael said, stirring his tea. Elena nodded, a satisfied glint in her eye. A necessary metamorphosis. "They're trying to save themselves, of course, but the result is the same. The landscape has shifted. The conversation has changed. Other companies are now scrambling to draft their own ethical integrity positions. You've started a trend, Michael." "We did," he corrected gently. She smiled, accepting the correction. "We did." She sipped her tea. "And how is life at Ethereum? Is David still living up to his hype?" "He is. It's good. It's more than good. It feels like I'm finally using the right tools for the right job." He paused, looking at his daughter, who was carefully tracing the spiral of her new fossil. "I read an article the other day. It mentioned the Thorn precedent. They're using my name for the practice of prioritizing ethical audits during mergers." Elena's smile widened. "Get used to it. You're part of the lexicon now." They talked for an hour, the conversation easy and familiar. It wasn't about strategies or corporate battles anymore. It was about Lily's school play, about Elena's new independent media platform's soaring ratings, about the simple, ordinary joy of a life no longer defined by desperation. As the evening drew to a close and Michael signaled to Lily that it was time to go, Elena walked them to the door. The New York night was crisp and clear, the sky a deep velvet blue peppered with stars that managed to shine through the city's glare. "You know," Elena said, standing on her stoop, her arms crossed against the chill, "we talk about the big moments, the broadcasts, the stock crashes, the takedowns. We think that's what changes the world. But it isn't." She looked at Michael, her expression serious and sincere. It was a single, quiet decision on a dirty floor. That was the catalyst. Everything else was just physics. Michael nodded, Lily's small, warm hand securely in his. He looked from the powerful woman in the doorway to his brilliant, beloved daughter, and then out at the glittering, relentless city. He thought of the long, desperate run through Midtown, the cold dread in the hospital, the crushing weight of Harrison's contempt. He had believed he was losing everything, but in that moment of surrender, in choosing basic human decency over his own desperate ambition, he had unknowingly planted a seed. That seed had grown through the scorched earth of a corporate scandal, through the fierce light of public accountability, and had finally borne fruit in the quiet, secure happiness of his daughter's life, in the reformed practices of a corporate giant. In the very air of integrity he now helped breathe into his work, The groan of ancient plumbing, the lumpy couch, the arithmetic of fear, they were chapters in a closed book. The story now was one of stability, of purpose, of love. He squeezed Lily's hand. "Ready to go home, sweet pea?" "Yes, Daddy." He led her down the brownstone steps, the weight of the world no longer a crushing burden on his shoulders, but a solid foundation beneath his feet. He had learned that true wealth wasn't in a bank account or a job title. It was in the unshakable knowledge that his integrity, once his greatest liability in a cynical world, had become his most valuable asset, paying dividends in a currency of peace, purpose, and a future bright with promise. The long, desperate race was over. He had finally, truly arrived.